The Washington Post held its annual Cybersecurity Summit yesterday, with discussions about how to protect government and private sector computer networks. Speakers include the director of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and House Intelligence Committee Chairman Mike Rogers. This is 3 hours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Jordan of the Washington Post, and thanks for those watching online and here in downtown Washington at the Washington Post headquarters. This is the 4th year that the Post has had a cybersecurity conference where we bring together government, defense, State Department, Homeland Security, and the business leaders all together to talk about cyber theft and cyber espionage. And the challenge over these years has only intensified. The U.S. government and companies are now investing billions, many, many billions, to try to secure what is valuable and what, by virtue of being connected to the internet, is vulnerable. There's a lot of bad actors out there, and they're very, very good at stealing. They're great hackers, in fact. And what they're stealing is everything from the next generation fighter plans that the Defense Department has to a stash of credit card numbers. The theft is forcing important but uneasy alliances between government and the private sector, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. So how to secure what a company, what the government, what each of you here put up online is actually only becoming more and more relevant because more and more of our lives are online. Our devices are connected, our houses are connected, soon our cars will be connected, our medical devices. And so we have a remarkable group of people here from Capitol Hill, from corporate boardrooms, from research labs to talk about how to make our lives online more secure. So I encourage you to tweet questions and comments to hashtag WashPostCyber, and if you're in the room here, you can send a question up to Allison at the question desk. And now, what a better way to start the morning than to talk to the director of the government agency that brought us the internet, DARPA. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has a long line of technological breakthroughs, from computer networking to stealth technology to GPS. With a $3 billion budget, DARPA's mission is to prevent technological surprise to the U.S. and to create technological surprise to our enemies. Let me welcome DARPA's director, Arthi Prabhakar. Okay. Arthi Prabhakar is now running DARPA, but she's been back and forth from the government sector to Silicon Valley. She's an electrical engineer. She's had many huge jobs in both sectors. President Clinton appointed her the director of National Institute of Standards and Technology. Before running the whole show at DARPA, she was running part of it as a manager and office director, and she's held huge jobs in the private sector at Raychem, Interval Tech, and U.S. Venture Partners. So, perhaps the woman with the coolest job in the city is going to briefly explain what DARPA's role is.
Thank you very much, first of all, Mary, for the chance to be here. I think it's great to shine a light on this vitally important topic. You know, what you said about DARPA a minute ago is absolutely correct. We were created in the wake of Sputnik because we knew we didn't want to experience those kinds of surprises anymore. We sort of like creating them instead, and that's really what DARPA has been about for 6 decades now. The internet is one of our babies we're very proud of, but it's sort of in this fractious teenage period now with all the problems that we're dealing with. So our mission today is still about breakthrough technologies for national security. In cybersecurity, you know, during the day, I think you're going to be hearing from people who are fighting these very tough these battles today about how do we keep ourselves secure, how do we engage with the policy issues. I'm very grateful for the work that's going on today. Our role is a little bit different because what we're asking about cybersecurity is what are the technology concepts that could fundamentally change the ground rules and give us a way to get out ahead of this explosion of challenge that we're seeing.
So give us some good news. So what are your big brains over there. You fund, actually, people in teams.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what are they working on that will kind of tame the unruly teenager?
Yeah, I'll give you 3 examples. We can talk about any or all of these in more detail. One of the things we're working on is how to completely reduce the attack surface so that it's harder for hackers to find ways in, including as we move into the Internet of Things with embedded systems.
And the attack surface just means ways in, vulnerable ways in.
How many ways in? A second example is we're looking at a really interesting new challenge, the Cyber Grand Challenge, to figure out how we can start having automated systems to fight cyber defense. We don't think we're going to be able to keyboard our way out ahead of this problem, and just throwing more people at it is simply not going to work, given how fast machines are able now to generate cyber vulnerabilities.
Let's just talk about that. So the Cyber Grand Challenge is interesting. How much money do you get if you win, by the way?
The first prize for the ultimate contest, which is June of 2016, is $2 million, and there's a set of other prizes along the way as well.
All right, so what do I have to do to get the $2 million?
Yeah, well, 90 teams have signed up to try to get the $2 million. What we're going to do, what we're in the process of doing, is building basically cyber warfare in a box. It'll be a separate cyber environment with a new operating system. It's going to be really like Capture the Flag at DEF CON, except we're creating a league of their own for machines to fight it out rather than human teams.
So I would have to create a robot.
Right, an information system. A set of programs, right?
And the whole goal of this is that, that instead of human error about detecting viruses, there's going to be an automated system.
Yeah, and human, I think the key point in my mind is we need to get to where we are able to do cyber defense at machine speed. Because when we're dealing with attacks that are being generated automatically by machine, those things happen at machine speed. They're happening in microseconds. They're not happening at the rate that you can type on a keyboard. And so today, really all we can do is patch and pray and keep throwing human beings at the problem. We're looking for a fundamentally different way to get faster than the pace of the growth of the threat.
All right, so patch and pray is not working. And this challenge, just one more thing on that, who are the people that sign up for this?
Yeah, we've been really excited with the people that have signed up. We've got this enormous range of talents. We got some very eye-popping names that have signed up. Suits, hackers,
Well, tell us some eye-poppers.
I don't know if, I actually don't know if that list is public, but...
Well, all the more reason to tell us.
Here's my big opportunity. Well, I will tell you where the website is. You can find it from the DARPA website, and whatever is out there is what's public, but I
mean, are these like big silicon brains? Are they kids? Are they, who are they?
Yeah, when you look across the 90, you'll find people that are all of the above. You'll find some superstars that are big academic names. You'll find people from companies. You'll find people in the hacker community.
And so in addition to this, I mean, again, I think people are looking to DARPA. You have come up with some pretty huge things like GPS and you worked, I mean, this is the unit that's some of your other all-star things about the screen on the touch screen too is also.
Yeah, well, if you look at your iPhone or your smartphone of any type, it's chock full of technologies that we helped start. Some of the materials in your touch phone, the chip that sends the radio wave to the cell tower. Siri actually started as a DARPA project, but that was groundwork that we did, and then this vast private investment came behind it and turned it into this amazing capability.
Can you talk to Siri and tell it to secure the networks?
I think you can tell it that. I think you shouldn't then sleep easy.
Going to go to some audience questions to see what they have on their minds. But in general, again, I think when you see how we're going to secure a network that now, by the end of this year, the UN says 3 billion people will be online. And because of the Internet of Things, which is just machines talking to machines, there's about estimated tens of billions of objects. So it's just getting harder and harder to feel that we have privacy, but also that we're not going to be robbed blind, whether it's trade secrets, government secrets, or credit cards. And so what is the big answer? What is kind of the big thing you're looking for?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, there's not going to be a silver bullet, but again, there are pieces of this that we think can become tractable. The Internet of Things, you know, in DoD, every one of our military systems has a computer or many computers in it. We're already living, in many regards, the Internet of Things with these embedded systems. One of our programs is finding ways to build software that is unhackable for specified security properties. And what that means is there's a mathematical proof that this particular function can't be hacked from the outside, from a pathway that wasn't intended. So, you know, that's not going to solve the entire problem, but especially for embedded systems that might have a more manageable, you know, a more modest number of lines of code that is tractable through this method. That's an example of reducing that attack surface, making it harder for people to come in, especially for our most critical vulnerabilities.
And then how do you keep the bad guys from getting unhackable software?
Well, that's a concern if you want to hack them, but you know, let's start by making sure we're secure, right, so that we can do our missions. I think that's.
But isn't a lot of the Defense Department's mission also to be offensive hacking? Because we're getting inundated. It's been well publicized by Russia, China, but we're also out there offensively.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're going to. I would hope you're going to get into the policy questions around offensive cyber. Just to take it in a slightly different direction, one of the other problems that I think we're seeing is just the vastness of the information space of the internet environment. We all love it, we use it to great effect, but it's also a place where bad actors hide what they're doing. And another one of our programs is specifically designed to find those kinds of deep hidden networks.
How do you do that?
You start by creating a different way to look at this vast information environment than how we search today. So a simple example, a project that we've been doing working with law enforcement, our thesis was that we might be able to develop a way to find hidden networks that would reveal a pattern that relates to human trafficking. We started working with law enforcement, learned that their use of that information space, how they explore that vast information space, is exactly the way you or I would go online and, you know, do a search with Google or whatever your favorite search engine is. It's this sort of single-threaded walk through this vast environment. And oh, by the way, it feels like search engines are indexing everything, but in fact, they're only indexing a very small fraction of the total public information that's out there. They're indexing what's optimized for advertising revenue. That makes sense, but they're not going to get to all the material that might be of interest to law enforcement. Our tools build deep cores through the web to look for these hidden patterns and linkages among websites. And in the first project that we did, we were able to find a set of phone numbers that were very heavily linked to each other in backpage ads where a lot of the sex trade is advertised now. We provided those phone numbers to law enforcement. We gave them 600 numbers that we said, gee, we don't know anything about these numbers. All we know is they seem to appear over and over again and they're linked to each other. Law enforcement found in that list 466 numbers that tied to criminal violations. They also found numbers that tied to fund transfers in the region around North Korea, and they're now working on finding human trafficking networks. So again, you know, we didn't give them a smoking gun, but we gave them a much more powerful way to start grappling with the sheer scale of the information.
When you look at the cyber universe, what % of it is the hidden black market criminal activity?
I don't think we even know. There's a huge amount of the internet that, as I mentioned, isn't indexed and isn't that readily available through the way we usually think about accessing it with search. Now, a lot of that is completely, completely benign. It's just all the legal and fruitful ways that we use the internet. But I think that's actually one of the great mysteries. The information explosion is so vast that we really don't even know how.
Do you have any guess? I mean, is it 10%? Is it?
I don't know. I've seen reports that, just as a simple example, that a very significant fraction of network traffic right now is botnets. Now, those could be benign botnets. These are just automated programs that go out and do something on the network.
But often
they could
malware.
be benign or they could be malignant. We don't even know, but we know that a lot of it is machine generated right now, which tells you something about scale.
Okay, we'll go to Allison for some audience questions.
Can you hear me? Okay. So you talked a little bit about patching and praying no longer working. Can you talk a little bit about the process being made on clean slate technology, this idea of rebuilding the internet with, with security in mind rather than patching and praying?
Yeah. Yeah, and just to be clear, I think patching and praying, it does work. It's the best thing we've got, so we must keep doing it as fast as we can. We just think we've got to get beyond it because it's a losing game. So one of the questions that we asked in recent years was, if you did have a clean slate, how would you rebuild systems to make them more fundamentally cyber secure? One of the ideas that came out of that was actually inspired by biology, where, in fact, one of the reasons that the human race, as an example, has survived, we survived plague, we're going to survive Ebola and other infectious disease, partly because under the hood, under the skin, there's a lot of diversity among individuals, and so one attack can't wipe out the entire human race. Similarly, we're now finding ways of building complex networked information systems where under the hood, each one is a little bit different. So an attacker, it just completely changes the economics for the attacker. Instead of one attack that can wipe out everything, as is usually the case, one attack might wipe out one thing. And it's just not that exciting, I think, from an attack point of view. Now, of course, the hard part is how do you make that not a systems administration nightmare? And so figuring out a way to have things diverse under the hood, but still work seamlessly and be able to be maintained seamlessly is where the challenge lies. But I think that's an example of clean slate thinking and then bringing those methodologies back to the way we do work today.
Go ahead.
One more.
Yeah.
So you started off by talking about DARPA being created in the wake of Sputnik. What's the moonshot for cyber security?
What's the moonshot for cyber? I think one of the hardest challenges about cyber is we're trying to wrangle this problem while the information explosion is continuing. You talked about 3 billion people on the internet, 7 billion on the planet, so we still have more to go. And as we move to the Internet of Things, there are going to be more and more elements connected into our information universe. So the moonshot for cybersecurity, in my view, is to find techniques that scale faster than this explosion in information. And again, I don't think it's going to be a silver bullet, but I think a combination of these fundamental advances, has the potential to get us to a place where, not where we never have a cybersecurity problem, but where it's manageable and we can get on with our lives.
When do you think that will happen? When will be this unease that we're under attack all the time? You pick up every single day. When do you think we'll feel more secure in cyber?
Yeah, I think it's going to happen in pieces, and I think it will happen, I think it's already happening, right? Our most critical systems get the most critical focused attention, and whether it's within DoD or more broadly throughout our economy, gradually I think we will achieve this greater state of cybersecurity. But I really don't want to be glib about it. I think this is incredibly technically challenging, and it's very challenging from a practical and from a policy perspective. So, that's the work that's out ahead of us all.
And there's been a lot of talk lately that, it's time, the internet is of the age, you were saying it's a teenager, that there needs to be some kind of a global body of regulations, standards that would issue an early warning system when there's a problem. What do you think? Is it time to create some kind of a body that has some kind of standard? Since right now we know that there's certain countries that are really literally off the grid, right?
Yes, no, that's true. I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that. I think you'll have others here who know a lot more about the policy aspect. The one thing I would really just think about when you go down that path is to recognize how dynamic and fluid this situation is, because the power of information technology and the reason we put up with all these problems is that it is phenomenally capable for all the things that change how we live and how we work and how we create national security. You don't want to cut any of that capability off in the process of building this underpinning for cybersecurity.
So the Defense Department in general and your outfit has a lot of priorities, a lot of big issues. Right now, a hot one that you're working on is staying out in front of infectious disease, very topical. tell us, how does securing the internet and cybersecurity rank in priorities?
Yeah, it's one of many efforts at DARPA, but I think of it as a truly foundational piece. A couple of other major things that we're doing at DARPA. One is about finding ways to wrangle biology and turn it into a useful technology. One example is work that we're doing to outpace the spread of infectious disease, a problem that actually, has a lot of resemblance to dealing with the outpacing the cybersecurity threat that we're dealing with. But those in biology, as an example, those are problems that we simply can't wrangle without using the power of big data and new information tools. So if we don't have that security, if we don't have the trust in those systems, we're not going to be able to solve this other, really different class.
But we've heard from the head of the CIA last year and then the head of the FBI that there is nothing that worries them more, because with jamming capability and hacking capability, you can take down critical infrastructure. You can actually do enormous amount of physical damage, let alone all the theft of intellectual property and trade secrets. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out, if we're hearing from one part of the government that it is like such a big threat, and so now, like, the big brains in here who are working on it, like, how hard are they working on it, or how big a deal is it in all the priorities?
Pretty darn hard, don't worry. But, let's just be clear. National security is there's not a single problem that if we solve it, the country can sleep easy, right? So, yes, it's an incredibly critical problem, but it's not the only problem. And I think it's important to just keep that in mind. Again, I think it's foundational, and we are going to have to deal with it because of all the other national security challenges. If we're going to build a new generation of complex military systems that can overpower a future peer adversary, that's critically important. Guess what? It also relies on cybersecurity capabilities. So I think they're linked, but I think you have to be clear that any of these issues that we deal with, cybersecurity is a piece of it.
And breakthrough. So when we do hear there's a breakthrough on cybersecurity, presumably it'll be out of your unit, and it will again, what's the core of what we're going to see? Again, it's not going to be relying on security of individual people, it'll be an automated system. Yeah,
and so just to give you an example, we're working on ways of building unhackable embedded systems. You will see that, I hope you will see that rolling out into automobiles in the commercial sector, and UAVs in the national security context or within DoD. Those will be new techniques and practices that get adopted by people who are building those systems. You might see, I hope after our Cyber Grand Challenge that you start to see automated cyber defense systems that become commercial products that people who are worrying about their own cybersecurity can purchase and start using. That's how you'll see it.
And one thing on the same type of grand challenge led to driverless cars.
Yeah, absolutely. Our first major challenges were about, the urban challenge was a major significant one about a decade ago. Could a vehicle navigate without a human being in it? Through a particular environment. And if you want to find the number 1, number 2, and number 3 teams that came out of that challenge successfully, you should go visit Google and see their self-driving car project, because a bunch of those folks are there. So a great example of using the challenge and then letting that technology go out in the world. A lot more work has to happen after we show it's possible, and it's great to see that happening there.
So we'll be paying attention to that grand challenge. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks so much,
Arthi Prabhakar. Thanks. Thank you. And now I want to welcome my colleague, Dana Priest, who actually has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and is one of the most well-known and respected journalists in national security in the United States. And she is going to interview the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Representative Mike Rogers. They're going to talk, and then Dana's going to stay on stage, and she has an all-star panel from Justice, State, and Defense. Thanks, Dana. Thanks. Good
to see you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
I know this is on cybersecurity, but I wanted to start out just briefly on White House security, since it's just such a topic.
Oh, look at the time. Boy,
I assume you get briefed on these intrusions, and have there been some foreign intrusions we haven't read about, or other things we're going to read about? Because
you want to see in the classified cabinet, don't you, Dana? Obviously this is of concern, so there's two problems. One, as many in the security business know, the static security footprint is always the most difficult, it's always the most challenge to keep and maintain a state of readiness. So there'll have to be some reviews of how they continue to test and audit that system in real time to make sure that that system is functioning properly. Clearly, I think the level of readiness decreased when the president was off the grounds, which shouldn't happen, but did. So you'll have to do a couple of things. Is the systems they have, are they working? Are they appropriate, number one? And number two, then you have to start asking the hard questions about the culture. Is there a cultural management problem at the Secret Service that allows for that kind of behavior to happen? And that is a more troublesome, I think more difficult, and certainly more subjective list of questions and things that the Congress is going to have to ask.
Okay, so we'll rely on our reporters to get into the details of the. Okay.
I look really bad in those orange jumpsuits with the numbers on the back. It makes me look very boxy, very.
Okay. So cybersecurity.
Yeah.
ISIS obviously has shown that it has a cyber communications capability that's much more sophisticated than Al-Qaeda started out with. Have you seen them probe, attack government systems?
We have not. Now, what we have seen in the past is that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, other organizations have reached out and tried to find individuals that had the right capabilities to put together a cyber attack capability. And we watched that happen. We've never seen them actually put it together to where they could actually penetrate or do some cyber disruption activities. But we know they have the aspiration to do it. They've advertised for it in their social network and their recruiting networks. But I don't believe today that they would pose a threat in the cyber realm like we see in even criminal enterprises.
And how about Al-Qaeda at this point? What's their capability?
I think it's the same. I think they're trying to put their capabilities together. They spend a lot of time, as you noted, on the public relations portion of their operation. And they use social media in an incredibly effective way, in a way that you haven't seen in the past. Certainly, the Islamic State has upped their game and used that tool as a way not only to subjugate people to their violent political ends, but to use as a recruiting tool. Some estimates are as high as 3,400 per month now joining their fight because of their social media recruiting efforts. And so that part is all dangerous. I don't see them yet engaging in the cyber attack mode, if you will.
Do you think that the United States is actively trying to counter that in a way that's more effective than they did in the beginning of the Al-Qaeda cyber communications?
No, actually, I don't. I don't believe that on the social media side that the U.S. government, using all of its abilities and capabilities, have really pushed back in a way that I think we have the capability to do and candidly should do.
And why is that?
We still wrestle with the policies of what is appropriate and what isn't, and we should have that debate. We should know what we're doing and make sure it's appropriate when you step out on taking those offensive actions. There's some nibbling at the edges. I don't want you to walk away thinking the intelligence community isn't doing anything about that. That would be inaccurate. But I don't think that we're using all of U.S. capability when it comes to our cyber capabilities to disrupt their ability to have these recruiting tools that we see are candidly very effective.
Does that mean the decisions for threshold offensive attacks still are being debated within the administration and the community? They still have not really gotten those red lines clear?
I'm just assuming you're talking about offensive capability. No, we don't. And as the USG writ large, we don't have the policies down. We debate it a lot. I can't tell you how much time we've spent in the Intelligence Committee trying to figure out the way forward on what that looks like. And part of the challenge is the government has about 15% of the networks. And the private sector holds about 85% of the networks. And contrary to popular belief, the NSA is not monitoring those networks. It's not on those networks. So the only way that they see anything coming in is from the outside. So most of the offensive talk is from the private sector saying, I've had enough, and I'm going to go do something about it. Because basically what we've done today by doing nothing in Congress is telling these 85% of these private networks, you're on your own. You have nation states who are targeting you, who are ravaging your networks, but you're on your own. Good luck. I
But
hope that works.
surely if it's a national security threat, you can trump the reluctance
You
of
would
the
be
private
surprised about how far away we are from really good, understandable policy on what offensive operations look like and should be.
I don't understand that.
Because it's very
after all
difficult.
these-
Think of the public debate we've had after the NSA contractor leaked information. Most of it is wildly inaccurate. And the political narrative is the NSA is reading all your email and listening to all your phone calls. Politicians use that on the campaign trail. Serious presidential politicians use that on the campaign trail. And that is an easy thing to believe if you're not exposed to understanding what the rules of law and what the parameters we set on our intelligence agencies. So you're fighting a narrative that is completely inaccurate at a time when we are absolutely under siege, and that's been our challenge.
Have you seen
And attribution is a problem here, by the way. You want to make sure that we get the right attribution. You don't want to reach overseas and flick somebody in the forehead if we're not exactly 100% sure that that was the perpetrator of that particular event. NSA, capable of doing that. I think their capabilities are getting better and better to understanding who that signature is. Private sector is good. Some are better than others. Obviously, there's a mix out there. Some could do it, some couldn't do it. So if you start this digital vigilantism about, well, I got hacked, I'm going to go do something about it, you could create a storm here of which the rest of the network, that 85%, is not prepared to handle.
Have you sensed an uptick in what you might call counterattacks against the United States, either because foreign entities or governments perceive that the NSA is actually acting more offensively, or in some cases is?
Well, we've seen a couple of interesting trends that I think are very dangerous. Again, why we need to get this right very soon. One was in public reports that Iran has been at least probing our financial institutions. And we know that they have a capability, Saudi Aramco, that clearly allows them to have destructive attacks so that they destroy data when they get there. And they basically made about 30,000 computers paperweights. All that information non-extractable. I mean, they really almost put Saudi Aramco out of business. And so we know that they've been probing U.S. financial institutions, according to public reports, and that in and of itself is a problem. That means a nation state has made the determination that they're using cyber as their way of using that as their political tool to influence or damage the United States. So this debate about
Can you quantify that? Is it a dozen probes? Is it hundreds, thousands?
It would be in the nature of hundreds. Now, we have seen a little bit of that fall off into this year, and we assume that's because they're waiting to see what happens with the negotiations. But the very fact that a nation state believed that they could do that without any problem or consequence is another very, very serious issue for us. The latest round, and again, according to some public reports, that the Russians were also flying around or attempting to get into some of our financial institutions. And the question is, A, why? And the way they were doing it certainly might raise some questions. Was it designed to be destructive or disruptive in our economic fabric, if you will? And it was believed that they decided to make that decision based on the fact that they were having these sanctions imposed, and they believe, well, if you're imposing sanctions on us, we can use this very capable tool to cause you harm in your economy. This is a new, dangerous form of warfare and international relations that, candidly, the United States as a whole is not prepared to handle. Remember, the Russians can flick a switch, their internet goes down. The Chinese can flick a switch, their internet goes down. We don't do that, nor do we want to do that, nor should we do that. But again, that exposes these 85% of these private sector networks and puts them at the whim of nation-state capability in cyber. And this trend is very, very concerning.
Can you talk a little bit about what the evidence is for that link to the sanctions? Is it just a guess, or is it something better than
Well, let me just say, as someone who reviews all this, I believe that the timing of it, and you pair that with public reports, I clearly believe that the Russians had an intent to try to cause some harm, some disruption as a result of those sanctions. And so, again, that's why I think this is so dangerous and so important we get right on our defenses.
And it was the Russian state, not Russian independent hackers. And was it in any way?
That is getting harder and harder to determine. So the SVR and the FSB has very interesting relationships, not only in their hacking community, but the international organized crime community. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference.
And what did they manage to do to disrupt?
Well, I'm really not at liberty to discuss who or what their efforts were, other than to say, again, according to public reports, it raised questions on what their intent was. It there to try to monitor, say, transactions, so you could let your imagination roll here a little bit, or was it to go in and destroy enough data to cause economic harm in transactions in the marketplace? Any one of those conclusions is pretty bad.
So I'm letting my imagination roll. Monitoring financial transactions between who?
I mean, again, I can't get too close to that. But again, it was enough of an alarm for me to ramp up our effort to say, hey, we've got to put our defenses in place. And remember, any action on behalf of the U.S. government, so we talked about, well, okay, so what do you do about that? Do you offensively go and as we say, flick them in the forehead in that particular unit that's operating, or that particular IP address? The problem with that is that the attack won't necessarily come back to the U.S. government. That our security services are very good about trying to get what the threat matrix is and apply that to the protection of our networks. But that's only 15% of the networks. So that 85%, it does not benefit from that information currently and today, and that would expose them to this attack. They're not likely to come back at whatever agency participated in that. They're likely to try to come back again in the private, one of those private sector networks, to cause their harm, damage, and or take control.
How many times since you've been chairman of the committee have we flicked somebody in the forehead, as you said? Without saying who, just, is it?
Not counting my staff to me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, again, part of the problem is, this notion of what is an offensive response, right? So we haven't gotten there yet. And again, I used to say, if you're going to go punch your neighbor in the nose, best to hit the weight room for a couple of months first, right? We are not prepared if the federal government decides that they want to take an offensive action or a disruptive action in any significant way, even in response. It's, again, not the government that we're worried about. Networks,
right.
We can hunker down, put the helmets on. It's the 85% of the public networks that are exposed in that. And they will not be ready for what comes next. I will guarantee you that today. If you have a CIO in any company that comes in and said, sir, I'm ready and I can beat anything that comes, time to find a new CIO, right? Our nose is just above water. Even the best of the best out there are just trying to keep up with the pace of the threat.
So let's talk a minute, because we only have a minute, about industry and cybersecurity. Your bill is now, can you give us a quick update on where that is?
Sure.
Do you have any hope that it's going to be passed this?
I had a great conversation this week, yesterday, with Senator Feinstein. We have worked pretty closely on this. We have a very small window to get this done, very small window. It is not impossible, but the political challenges of the Senate right now make the hurdles pretty high, unfortunately. So only in the Senate can you tie a FISA issue with an Intel authorization bill with a cyber bill and mush it together. And so that's what we're trying to unwind those political tantrums, if you will, for holds and other things that are being placed in the Senate. My fear in this is, and Senator Feinstein, I think, shares this fear, is that if we don't get it done in this lame duck session, and the Senate will have some differences than our bill that passed in a bipartisan way in the House, not once but twice. we'll have some differences, but we think we can work those out in a conference committee pretty quickly, is that it all starts over. The clock starts over. So Saxby Chambliss will be gone. He's retiring. I'll be leaving as chairman. You're going to have, it's going to take some time to ramp it up. And we've asked House members now to vote on this very difficult issue because it's, again, the political narrative, I think, is wrong on what's going on out there. And there's a lack of understanding what the real threat is. I'm not, this could be years before this gets done. And that's why we have heightened the awareness about how important this is to get done in this very brief window that we have left, if we're going to have any success in trying to push back at what is a growing threat. Now you have criminal organizations that have nation-state capabilities that we didn't see just even a year ago. I mean, and this is only going to get worse. It is only going to get worse. Nude photos could be the best thing that ever happened that got, stolen off the cloud, right? I mean, seriously, you think about the sheer threat level of economic damage. Your lights go out and they don't come back on. I mean, we have some really significant challenges here that we're just not prepared to handle.
Okay.
That was
we're going to leave it on, we're getting worse, but thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to enlarge our stage here. Change positions. Hello. First we have Christopher Painter from the State Department. You too. Have a seat. And John Carlin from DOJ, National Security.
Hi.
And you're going to explain your title, which keeps growing, but this is Eric Rosenbach from DOD. So we have all branches of national security just about represented here. Can you first explain your title?
Yeah, I just got confirmed by the Senate last week as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Global Security. So that's a whole wide path of stuff in Homeland Defense and Global Security. Cyber is definitely one of those things, but I'm also dual-hatted as the Principal Cyber Advisor to the Secretary, something that the Senate put into law last year to kind of help coordinate all the things that go on cyber-wise in the Department of Defense.
Okay, so I actually wanted to start with you for a minute because...
First victim, right?
Yeah. When I think about the military and Homeland Security, you think about, obviously, posse comitatus and some bright red lines about when the military can participate or not, but cyber doesn't have bright red lines, as I can tell. So where are your limits?
That's a great question. We, in the interagency, with my colleagues here, we spent a lot of time thinking about that the past several years. And there are no bright lines, but there is a bright line for DOD in that we don't do domestic cyber operations unless with the National Guard. There's more leeway there for posse comitatus. But when it's a domestic issue, then it's always the Department of Homeland Security or FBI in the lead. And then either Cybercom or NSA will provide them with technical type support. That's the way it works under the law. Now, a couple of years ago, there was a kind of raging debate about who should have the lead on this. There were some ideas maybe it should be NSA and Cybercom as opposed to DHS. And we settled that, and to the point now, there's a very good working relationship. We know what the roles and responsibilities are, and everyone kind of understands what their place is in the game, and it's a team sport, we like to say, and we all work in our different positions.
So you gave me a perfect next question, which is what can the National Guard do? You said they're the exception.
Yeah, we spent about the last several months thinking about the role of the National Guard because we made the decision 2 years ago to build out the force structure of Cybercom, to develop a force that was about 6,000 people, elite cyber warriors, kind of the Special Operations Command for cyber. And then we recognize that we need to figure out how to use the National Guard. They have some pretty unique attributes. So for example, I recently went out to Washington State and I met Guard members who work full-time for Microsoft, but work for the Guard on the weekends and in the summer, very highly skilled. They're definitely not working in the Guard for money, and they bring a lot to the table. They also have a unique authority set, so they can support DHS, support the governor first and foremost, and there's a role they can probably play in protecting critical infrastructure. So we want them to be part of the overall cyber force, but have the unique role that the Guard does in doing state-type activities and helping with other civil homeland defense issues.
And so has that become a new policy?
In this analysis, we outlined what we think the role of the Guard is, and we'll be building some force structure behind that, giving them the training that they'll be required to be up to the standard of the Cyber Mission Force. And that is something that's new. It's something that's good and positive.
Okay. And John, how do you, how do you use the military as maybe a backup investigative force? They're much bigger than you are. Talk a little bit about that.
First, I was hoping to get the question of what's my title. I was ready for that, but
What is your title? No, John has much broader responsibility. He's in charge of the entire National Security Division at DOJ. So,
I'd say this in terms of the roles inside the United States, that they lead in terms of the investigation, attribution, and obviously prosecution would be the FBI and the Department of Justice. Now, FBI has set up a center, and we've mastered bad acronyms and making as many as possible, so this one's a mouthful, but it's the NCIJTF, or National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, or as my former boss, Director Mueller, would put it, the task force. But it's FBI administered, but it has capability from every agency, from Secret Service, on the law enforcement side, to NSA, to make sure that when you're doing the investigation and attribution of a domestic threat, that you have all the information in one place so you can best figure out who is that actor, where is it coming from, and what can we do to stop it.
And given the relative size difference between you two, I mean, do you then end up using military assets to help you in the investigation quite a bit?
And I, in some ways, have to defer that to FBI colleagues. In my experience, in the usual criminal case, or now as we focus on nation-state actors and looking to see terrorist groups, no, I think the FBI has significant capabilities that both the prior directors he was leaving said would be their top priority, and Director Comey, as he has come in, has said that's what he sees as the top challenge over the coming years. And they do work closely with Department of Homeland Security, where Department of Homeland Security is focused on what would we do if an attack is successful, in order to try to build resiliency in the companies. Or the FBI's prime focus is how do we figure out who did it to stop them from doing it again.
And any time you talk about cyber, it's so invisible to the public that I think that's one of your challenges. So can you make it a little more visible and quantify? Are you seeing more? Can you quantify the increase that we hear there is in cyber attacks in the U.S., both against private sector and government? Is there a way to do that?
So one framework, which I think just fits with people's common sense and experience of the world, is, and many parts of this are good, but we as a nation and many countries in the world have put almost everything we value into cyberspace. We've put our personal information, we've put our financial information, we've put the way that we operate our critical infrastructure. It's digitally stored, and most of it's connected to the internet. Now, the flip side of that means all the same bad guys and all the same activity that we've seen for years in the brick and mortar world is going after where the money is, where the secrets are, and where they can cause damage. And so as we put more of what we value, we're seeing the number of criminal groups trying to target it increase. We're seeing nation states develop it as part of their strategies. There was a recent estimate, relatively recent, I think, from a panel that former Governor Huntsman commissioned, that said they estimated the loss on the economic side to be in a range of $300 billion of lost intellectual property, which would equal our foreign exports to Asia. Another figure that Chairman Rogers put out is just looking at one attack, the Saudi Aramco attack, where someone wanted to do something destructive with a virus Shamoon that's not particularly sophisticated, was able to wipe 30,000 computers out. And looking forward, there was a good criminal takedown in a case called Game Over Zeus. This was an infection that infected hundreds of thousands of people's computers. And the bad guys there, the criminals, were using it for profit. They would lock you out, say, as a reporter, of your files, you desperately want to get them back, and so you pay them to get them back. It doesn't take much imagination to say, hey, if a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda, where Zawahiri has publicly put out a videotape saying what his intent is, which would be to cause harm, if they get access to that same tool, they're not going to use it to get money. They're going to use it to destroy as much information as they can.
So does the government have figures that you can talk about that show an increase instead of relying on someone else's panel? I mean, you're inside, you see these.
I'd say, I would defer that yes, we are seeing an increase.
By how much? How do you quantify that?
So you're seeing an increase in the number of reported incidents.
Like a 50% increase or a 10% increase?
That figure I don't have for you.
But you do have one. I mean, again, of course I'm trying to prod you, but this is by nature an invisible threat to most people. So I'm a little confused about why the government doesn't make it more clear. You know, what exactly has been the increase? No.
Well, I think you can, there are many different ways you can try to measure the increase in what you're seeing. And so it's like a white-collar crime issue, and I used to prosecute those cases. You can't give a precise figure how many dollars were lost to white-collar criminals, in part because until you investigate and work with, you don't have a precise figure because until you dig, it's invisible. But what you can see, for instance, the head of BP put out, they're seeing 50,000 incidents a day. Right. And we're seeing that increase in reporting from all of our private sector colleagues. The intelligence community can also say we're seeing an increase in the intrusions that we see that we're able to detect. And again, going back to the common sense, that's where the information is. And when we do bring a case, we're seeing startlingly large amounts of information being taken. What I hesitate is the more, and we've put additional resources into shining that flashlight, and as we do it, we see more. Does that mean we're seeing the total picture? And no, I don't think it does.
Okay. In fairness, I think one of the problems, and I've been doing this a very long time in different aspects, including at DOJ, is that it is hard to quantify because, just as you say, it's hidden often. So the reporting is not perfect. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know a lot of the intrusions that are never reported by companies or individuals. We're seeing better reporting now, not just in the United States, but around the world. So that gives you a better sense of the picture. And sometimes people are more willing to tell computer emergency response teams or willing to tell private companies who are gathering this data than they are willing to report to law enforcement. And partly that's driven by maybe a misunderstanding of what law enforcement can do for them. So I think we're getting a better picture, but I think the danger of just trying to quantify a 50%, 100% increase is difficult. What we are seeing, I think, are more serious attacks, and Saudi Aramco is a good example. We're seeing, because people rely on the technology a lot more, dependence, and then when these attacks happen or when these thefts happen, it has more consequence. And when we talk about theft of intellectual property, one of the big challenges, again, is you understand when you're a company and your physical asset is taken, it's not there anymore. You don't understand necessarily when your trade secrets are taken. You don't understand what the long-term consequences are to the lifeblood of your company. And so quantifying that is a challenge, but I think we're clearly seeing an uptick.
Do you think that there's sort of a Snowden hangover, I might call it, in terms of trying to get private tech companies to cooperate with the government? You know, you see Apple and Google encryption as a way of saying to their customers, you know, we're impenetrable. Is that having an effect in being able to ask people to help out and tell us what's happening in your company?
There's probably a couple of phenomena that are happening simultaneously. One is the private sector is getting better, and the government is getting better at sharing information, but we need to do more faster.
So there hasn't been a reluctance because of the NSA revelations?
Well, let me put it in different buckets. I think at the same time that was occurring, you've had the Target intrusion, Home Depot, and when I go out compared to when we were doing this in 05, 06 and talk to companies, I see an awareness of the threat at the highest levels of the company in a way that we simply haven't seen before. And so that's a good thing, and that leads them to think about, hey, what do I do if I've been intruded upon? What do my shareholders and customers expect of me? Do I have a response plan to go to law enforcement? You also see for the first time the president chairing the Security Council, and a unanimous Security Council resolution that talks about the combating violent extremism, combating the foreign terrorist fighter threat, and a need to do that where it's taking place, which is in social media in part. And you saw that as part of that Security Council resolution. And the third phenomenon is the one that you refer to, speaking not as a national security prosecutor, but as someone who used to do the sex offense, domestic violence cases as well. I think you heard the Attorney General yesterday speaking to the Global Alliance that seeks to protect children online, and saying it would be unfortunate, and we're going to need the cooperation of companies, that when you have a lawful court order, like a search warrant for a state and local police officer, that you need to be able to serve that. And that's a debate or discussion we need to have to figure out the right response.
Chris, could I ask you the same question vis-a-vis international partners? And can you back up and tell us, how do international partners share information on terrorist cyber attacks?
Well, I mean, not just terrorist cyber attacks, I mean more broadly on cyber attacks. And I think one of the things that we've been focused on doing is working internationally to build those partnerships. And we work with FBI, we work with and DOJ, we work with US Army, we work with DOD. One of the things that Eric said in the beginning, I just want to reemphasize, which is, one of the things I've seen in the past few years, which is a little inside the Beltway, but really remarkable, is a really coming together of all these different federal agencies and working much more seamlessly together. So to give you an example that goes to your point, when we had the denial of service attacks that were coming and hitting our financial institutions over a period of time, we were working, DHS was reaching out to, these were botnets, so botnets can be concentrated all over the world, and the concentration can change from day to day. So they were reaching out to their counterparts, the technical experts. The FBI was reaching out to their counterparts. But there's a lot of noise out there. We make a lot of technical requests all the time. So what we did, and this is unique for us, is the State Department decided to do demarches. Now, before coming to the State Department, I always thought a demarche was a bad thing.
Right.
It sounds bad. But you can have a positive demarche. You can have something where you say, I need your help on something. I want you to elevate this. And so for about 20 countries, we said, look, this is serious. We really want your help. We want to build more of a cooperative framework to deal with these common threats. And so that's been part of our mission, working with the other agencies. The problem is more and more countries, I think, or the good thing is more and more countries are now taking this seriously. We've seen in the US that this is not just a technical issue, and that's been the other transformation. People used to go in, when I was justice and other places, you'd go into, and even the White House, you'd go in and talk to folks, and they thought, well, it's a technical issue. I don't really understand this. I'll have the technical experts deal with it. Now, people understand it's a major national security issue, in the US especially, national security issue, economic security issue, human rights issue, and foreign policy issue. And getting other countries to get to that same level is one of the challenges, but more and more countries are. So building that cooperative relationship, both on the technical level, but also on the policy level, because there's a long-term game here too in terms of diplomacy, what proper norms of behavior are, confidence-building measures between countries, those are all really important. So the consequence of, as I often say, cyber being the new black, where everyone cares about cyber and everyone wants to talk about cyber in the US, is increasingly happening around the world. As you get countries doing national strategies around cyberspace, which we've had for some time, but more and more countries are doing it, as you get them paying more attention to this, and as you get them reaching out and saying, how can we build these more cooperative frameworks against these threats, I think that's helpful to us all.
So are there, if I could just, one more question about this, do we mainly do it bilaterally? Or are
both. So we, for instance, we have dedicated what we call all of government bilateral relationships with a number of countries where we've had cyber discussions focused on the full range of cyber issues, including issues of internet governance and human rights and internet freedom, but especially on security. And we bring our colleagues from DOJ and DOD and DHS and Commerce and the whole suite of agencies. And that forces the other government to bring the whole suite of agencies because often they don't necessarily know what's happening. We used to have stovepipes of excellence in the US, and so that's replicated other places. So we've had those more formal ones. We have that with Germany. We have that with a number of our close partners like the UK and Australia and others. We've had that with India, and we're renewing that, I think, out of the joint statement, the presidential joint statement yesterday talked about renewing our cybersecurity dialogue with India. We've had it with Japan, with Korea, and other countries. So that's one aspect. But then we've also done multilateral work. We've done it within the Organization of American States. We've done it within ASEAN. We've done it in what's called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where we, as a landmark thing, got the first what are called confidence building measures. And this is not rocket science. It's just like how you build better transparency and confidence, transparency, cooperation, and ultimately stability. With all the, I think it's 57 countries in the OSCE, we got these confidence building measures last year. We're implementing them now. So we have to look at both of those networks and then also leverage our law enforcement networks, our CERT networks, and our DoD networks as we reach out to these countries.
So Eric, yeah, I was going to say, do you have similar cooperative agreements?
We do. We'll work with other nations' militaries, very often try to do capacity building. There's a lot of demand in the world right now for people trying to figure out how to build their equivalent of a cyber command. And the reason we do that is we want them to do that in a responsible way. There's some things we've learned that we didn't do as well as we could have. How you balance that with respect for civil liberties within the law, executive oversight of military organizations. And there's another point that I wanted to make that builds on what Chris was talking about, and also Chairman Rogers talked about this. Offensive operations are something that are always an option, but it's only one of many tools that you have available on the policy spectrum. And we have made the very conscious decision, especially in DoD, that that should be one of the very last things that you go to, right? Before you would ever take offensive action, you would want to work diplomatic channels first, work law enforcement channels. And so the policymaking process in the White House and the interagency is pretty sophisticated right now based on this for cyber. And a lot of it has to do with the fact we got a lot of practice at that during the denial of service attacks. And some of the past years, there's been pretty significant threats.
Can I just add one other thing to what we were saying before in terms of how we build better cooperation? The other part of this that I left out was capacity building, particularly for the developing world. And so we have done, again with our colleagues, we've done them in East Africa, we've done a couple in West Africa, regional ones, we've done one in South Africa, we're looking at Asia, where we talk about cybercrime, we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about building both structures in government, but also capability. And we also talk about the civil liberties issues and the public-private partnership issues.
And are we actually transferring funds in order to increase?
Well, there's been a lot of work where we're trying to, again, through our partners, build, for instance, CERTs, build law enforcement channels, build good cybercrime laws. There's been a lot of activities we've undertaken. I think it's one of these things where we're always challenged not just by funds, but by actual physical people resources who can do this, because the bench isn't that deep. But I think that's something that's a priority.
Let me follow up on your sort of foreign cyber command idea. Is the U.S. training particular countries now to stand up cyber commands? And can you talk about who those would be?
I think last estimate in the public press, there are about 60 countries that are looking at building a cyber command, which isn't surprising, mostly because they want to defend their own networks. There are a group of countries, a small group of countries that we work very actively on, kind of giving consulting and advisory advice about how we did it and things that they can do to build it in terms of training, doctrine, all of the things you do when you're building a military force. But we only do it with our very closest partners, mostly because we want to make sure that it's been done right. And also, we're very conscious of the fact that a lot of countries want to build offensive capability, which we're not in favor of. We would strongly prefer that that's something that, is...
So have we done it in countries that are allies, but also developing? Pakistan, Egypt?
Not as much. And, quite frankly, the biggest demand signal comes from countries that have more traditionally well-developed relationships with the Department of Defense.
Like Europe?
That's right. And then we also spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of time in the Gulf trying to help them build capacity and also, make sure that that's balanced with good governance. Those are the two areas, but also in Asia, we have some very strong partnerships.
Like Vietnam or who in Asia?
This is one of those things where most of the countries prefer that we don't speak publicly about it. And I think, just to honor that relationship, it's probably better not to name names, so to speak.
Okay.
There's always, you know, like the Five Eyes partnerships. It's
Right.
very, very close. Close allies like the French or the Germans, we always want to work with. And those are things that Chris and DOJ are also involved in, so that it's a balance of perspectives.
The problem overseas, though, is that you are dealing with countries who are in the process of censoring their publics often,
Right,
and this is
exactly.
another tool for that. So how can you actually have any impact on that?
Well, I mean, part of the diplomatic effort is, as I said, this is a broad spectrum thing. We don't think of cyber in silos where we separate cybersecurity from human rights and other issues. And so we did get a resolution in the UN Human Rights Committee that said you have the same rights online that you have offline. Not shocking to any of us, but that actually was pretty major. And when we even think about technologies, and Wassenaar just recently came out with some recommendations in terms of technologies where you make sure that as you're giving aid or working on cybersecurity issues with countries, that you're not enabling them to better monitor their citizens or impinge on human rights. So that's always a delicate balance, but you got to make sure you do that. And then you have the larger context of what are the norms of behavior in cyberspace we're trying to promote. So, you know, at the very high level, as Eric said, as more and more countries develop these capabilities, you know, there should be some understandings of what's appropriate behavior. So in the UN last year, we got, in this group of government experts, we got something that said that international law, including the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law, applies in cyberspace. Again, that makes a lot of sense. But before, there were some countries that said, well, this is a completely lawless space. You can do whatever you want. So that's part of the long-term game of how these concepts like proportionality and distinction apply. What are the things below that level that states shouldn't do? And we've been talking about that in the U.S. government. What are the peacetime norms we should be promoting around the world? So that's part of the long-term game that you couple with the short-term game.
And in terms of that development, I think actions matter. And for a period of time, because these cases are very difficult to bring, and you need to put resources in on the front end in order to do the attribution and the investigation, because of the difficulty in developing the capability with our partners and the willingness for them to take parallel criminal actions. For a period of time, if it was a nation-state actor and they were conducting what would be traditional criminal activity, stealing economic information from private United States companies for private use by companies back in their home country, we were not pursuing those cases criminally. And I think starting in 2012 at the Department of Justice, we created a national security cyber specialist network in 94 U.S. attorneys' offices, all 94 U.S. attorneys' offices, hundreds of prosecutors. At the same time, the FBI announced a similar approach to how it did counterterrorism prosecutions, which is that it was going to share the intelligence side of the house with those trained prosecutors. Most of them will not result in criminal cases, but some will. And you saw the beginnings of that with the indictment of the 5 members of the People's Liberation Army. And the idea there is we are increasing what we do on the criminal side of the house, and we've had great cooperation now from, for instance, partners in Europe, where we'll do a global takedown of a criminal ring. But at the end of the day, if we follow the facts and evidence where they lead, and instead of leading to an organized crime group in Ukraine where we're looking for their cooperation, it happens to lead to 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, we're going to treat criminal activity as criminal activity. And that type of action, I think, helps build the norm, ultimately, of what's acceptable in this space.
And have you had cooperation from other nation states for determining attacks against, you know, the nation state here?
Yes, I think you're starting to see increased cooperation in law enforcement to law enforcement channels, prosecutor to prosecutor channels.
Okay. Where do you see, yes, do you have some emails? I think we're going to have...
just to end up here, can we just down the line from all your vantage points as an audience question, what's the cyber threat, who, the nation or group that keeps you up at night? Just from each of your...
Other than China and Russia. We know
what keeps me awake at night is the nations that are less deterrable. So in particular, Iran and North Korea, and the fact that there are even new vulnerabilities that come out every day that have an impact on the security of industrial control systems. So it's a set of hard things, an undeterrable or difficult to deter country, a lot of vulnerabilities, and it's very difficult to defend against. So I worry a lot about that stuff.
Given my general portfolio of terrorists and spies, if I wasn't a sound sleeper, I would never get a night's sleep. But I'd say the top threat, similarly, are those who would not be deterred. So if they had the capability, they would use it. And to my mind, that's the terrorist organizations who've declared their intent to cause maximum harm and are actively seeking to acquire the capability. And that's where each day I feel that all of us working together need to do more and faster, working with our private partners, so that we're not having as the 9/11 Commission recently put out, that we're not having a moment post 9/11 like moment where we all saw that coming and we didn't take sufficient action ahead of time.
Well, I live in Annis Morgan, so I've learned to get sleep at night deal with noise. But at the same time, I think I agree with what both of my friends have said. I think that the undeterrable, the either dedicated terrorists or rogue criminal groups or rogue states really pose a real issue. However, I think that really makes the case for having a much more cooperative framework to deal with those things, using law enforcement tools, making sure countries have laws in place and capabilities, using our outreach tools and our capacity building tools. And this is something that we are mainstreaming now as a foreign policy issue, when we're getting all of our posts around the world to have people who actually concentrate in this issue and work with the host governments. So, Mike Rogers said that we haven't seen the terrorist attack yet. We haven't. We've been talking about it for about 15 years now. There's lots of reasons for that, but there is a lot of vulnerabilities out there. And whether it's a terrorist or another group, they could take advantage of those capabilities and actually have a major impact, not just in the U.S., but also around the world. That's a big issue. And that's an issue not just for the United States. So that's why we have to build those partnerships. And the private sector is part of that.
One other thing, this also keeps me awake, is in DoD, my job is to worry a lot about that big cyber attack, but I also worry a lot that in thinking about, sometimes we may do things that impact one of the last great economic centers of gravity for the U.S., which is the IT industry in Silicon Valley and cybersecurity. And we do need to think a lot about that. I do think a lot about that. It makes it even harder to think about the defensive part, because you want to make sure you're not hurting, the economy in one of those great centers of gravity that we do have. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much, Eric, John, and Chris, and thank you. And we'll have our next panel up soon.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks to Eric Rosenbach from the Department of Defense, John Carlin, Department of Justice, and Chris Painter from State. I want to encourage, we've had great comments and questions coming off of Twitter. Please send them in to WashPost Cyber. And I also want to say that all of the speakers today are going to be excerpted in a special section of the paper that's going to come out next week. It's a special cybersecurity section, which will have articles and excerpts from what you hear. It'll also be up online at WashingtonPostLive.com. So up next, I want to welcome David Cho, who helps lead the newspaper's business coverage. We're going to switch here. We've been talking a lot to government people. Now we want to hear from some people in the private sector about cybersecurity. I'll leave it to you, David.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. My name is David Cho. I'm the Deputy Business Editor here at the Washington Post. Today we wanted to talk about something that's similar to the first panel, but more on the private sector. Anything with a computer is a target for hackers today. Your thermostat, your car, your pacemaker. Dick Cheney was worried about it. He probably still is. But also jails, dams, health networks, power grids, gas pipelines. How do we protect this vast infrastructure of things and services that we depend on today? That's the basic question that we're asking ourselves today. Fortunately, we have three terrific experts to guide us through this oft-confusing world. Let me just introduce them to you briefly. Security analyst and attorney Tiffany Rad is sitting right to my left. One of her claims to fame is that a few years ago she demonstrated that jail doors could be opened remotely. And we'll hear more about that shortly. Andy Bachman is a senior cyber and energy security strategist at Idaho National Labs. Before that, he's sitting at the far end. He was a security lead for IBM's global energy and utilities business and an advisor on energy security at the Chertoff Group. And Mike McCowan is a supervisory special agent in the FBI's cybersecurity division. He was part of the cybersecurity team that caught 5 Chinese military leaders stealing trade secrets and that investigated a Russian crime ring that stole $100 million from banks around the world. So everyone needs to behave with Mike in the room here. So anyway, let me just dive in. We have about 25 minutes, which isn't a ton of time. So I'll pose a couple questions, but if any of you have questions that you would like to ask them, just see my good friend Allison there. She's also pulling questions off Twitter. We'll get to her in maybe 2 or 3 questions from now. But first, Tiffany, let me start with you. Give us the lay of the land. What's been hacked to date, and what's at risk? And maybe you could give us a little bit about some of your previous work that you did.
My work that you referenced, we did in 2011, and with a team of 4. One was an exploit writer that we had on our team, Teague Newman and John Strauchs. We did about 2 weeks of research, and we found some vulnerabilities in 2011. So things have changed since then regarding how much really is connected through programmable logic controllers, SCADA systems, but generally part of critical infrastructure. So one of the things that we took from that research and what we were able to show the community was there's a lot that can be done by changing the security mindset and with training, and also having an avenue such as with ICS CERT and affiliated with the FBI, where independent security researchers can go to places if they want to do disclosures, especially in regards to different types of technologies that the government has and vulnerabilities that researchers may find.
Well, tell me a little bit about the car doors, prison doors. It was all the rage at some of the Black Hat conferences this summer.
Still, this summer at Black Hat and DEF CON, those are 2 of the biggest security conferences in the U.S. That's where a lot of independent security researchers and companies go to share the types of work that they have found. And the important part about it is they're there to share it. It's the ones who aren't, in some ways, giving public presentations that if you see it at Black Hat and DEF CON, it's probably already been done by other groups. So that type of conference is good for the government and for industry to see what really is the industry standard with security vulnerabilities and exploits. So, but now one of the very popular topics, it still is, with industrial control systems. In fact, there was a lab that was set up at DEF CON this year where people could go and tinker with industrial control systems. And it was nothing nefarious about the work that they were doing, but it's really teaching people about how to design more secure products and also what is possible at this time. And that's one of the reasons these conferences are actually very excellent for people in the private industry and the government to attend.
Can I chime in there?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks, David. Speaking about the value of Black Hat and DEF CON to improving security overall, one of the motivating factors is that if government and other forces in industry urge a particular type of product manufacturer to up their security rigor, their capability inside their products, and it doesn't happen, nice people at Black Hat and DEF CON are known to carry that product onto the stage and show how they can access it and do naughty things to it. That's a very, very bad form of advertising for the company in question that had its products it's had its weaknesses so demonstrated, but it also is a great motivator both for that company and then the peers who are imagining their own products in that spotlight.
And just to follow up on that a little bit, tell me the likelihood of an attack on a power grid, for example, and help get us wrap our heads around the consequences. Like, describe a little bit what's being done at Idaho National Labs to simulate attacks like these.
Okay, sure. To the first point, what is it like, or what is involved in for people that are thinking about going after critical energy, critical electric infrastructure, right? It's not, I'd say for layperson, it's not IT. You see elements of IT, you see some Windows operating systems, but the communication protocols and the types of processors and the amount of memory and the segmentation is often wholly different. In fact, for a standard IT hacker, it would be a very strange landscape, requiring a lot of special knowledge. Another aspect I would say about would-be attackers on the electric grid, usually in shorthand in the press has to say someone can take down the electric grid, the U.S. grid. But the grid is not all one thing. It's many different pieces, and it's designed to be resilient in the face of natural disasters and storm activity that happen all the time to it. So it's not as simple, it's not nearly as simple, I should say, as saying one very intelligent hacker can come in and start to take control of things. There's a lot of layers of protection, some of them vestigial from the way the grid was designed even before computers came to the fore that help serve that process. Quickly on Idaho National Lab, this is one of a dozen or so Department of Energy national labs. We focus on energy security matters, and because we're way out in the desert in Idaho, we have a huge test range where we don't just model what happens on the electric grid in computer simulations. You can actually do it in real time on a grid scale system or a utility scale system and see what is actually happening from a cyber or physical attack point of view.
Mike, let me get you to jump in here. How exposed, in your view, are the systems that control these networks? What are the weaknesses? Who knows them, and who is targeting them, in your view?
Well, obviously, I'll start with targeting. We look at a couple different factors. Could the targeting be for a particular company within a sector? Could it be that sector in general? Then if it's, well, backing up for a second, actually we have to decide, if something happened, was it accidental or malicious? Are we looking at insiders? Are we looking at maybe a contractor that was working in a facility? And then even within that, as we see these targeting, how can we share that information more? So we're involved in a lot of different outreach programs. Our InfoGuard program, which also breaks it up into sectors. We work a lot with DHS and their models for the critical infrastructure and how we share that information. We're also learning a lot ourselves. We talked about the Idaho labs and the training there, so we send a number of our agents there. But we also have pockets of agents that have that expertise for ICS and SCADA, and they may be around the country, but we have facilities to share that information. Back to the targeting in particular, we've gotten a lot better at sharing that information, even when it's of a classified nature. A couple years ago, we had a threat against the financial sector. We brought in a lot of the largest financial entities and gave them essentially what we would call clearance for a day.
And this was the Russian crime ring that was going after the banks?
Correct.
Is that right?
So in order to share that information that would help them in real time. So we were getting better at getting that information out in a controlled structure to sectors, to partners within that sector or outside. Again, contractors may have a lot of knowledge that they could share about indicators that they see. So we have a couple different platforms that do share that information, and the key being real-time information so it can be acted on proactively.
I see. You know, there are probably companies out there that say that they need more help from the government. Can you describe specific ways that, and let me just throw it open to any of you, sure, that this partnership could come together in better ways than it has now to help companies out there that are facing these attacks?
Okay, well, again, you'll hear me speak not just to the lab I'm from, Idaho, but to the lab system and Department of Energy for cybersecurity in general. The job of the labs is to be different than what's available in the commercial marketplace, to be anywhere from 3 to 5 years out in front. So the labs look at the current state of the art of what's available for security protections that you can purchase, products and services, and to imagine both the threats, the evolution of the threats, and ways to exploit technological capabilities so that they can do the R&D, get some hits, some misses, and ultimately that stuff can be transferred into the private sector to significantly advance and hopefully push forward and stay ahead of the threat as much as possible, or at least you would say keep up.
Andy, sorry, I'm going to jump in for a second. Andy, you're on the ground. You're out there talking to these utility companies. Who, you know, what are you hearing? What's their biggest concerns? Is it the cost of increase? What are they working? Like, what are they up against?
I'd say first of all, the number for people ascribed for the number of utilities in the United States is somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000. We think of them as one thing, an electric utility, but really they range from Fortune 10 companies that have some of the most sophisticated and capable security folks and tools in the world, all the way down to a 100-person co-op with a security person who also doubles as a maintenance person, a safety person. So depending on where they are in that spectrum, the challenges that they face and what they bring to bear, how much help they need from external sources varies widely. I'd say one important point would be to know that should think of all utility just like any other asset-intensive industry. Somebody that relies on heavy equipment and machinery. You can think of transportation, water, oil and gas, et cetera, as having a cultural divide, a historic cultural divide between IT, the types of standard cyber systems that we've talked about here up till now, and then OT, operational technology. And it's getting the utilities to put their efforts not just into the IT side, but to look the OT issues, which we call industrial control systems. Many of them go back many years before they were connected to everything. Smart grid starting to connect everything, and I'd say coming around to the ultimate question, the smart grid driving interconnection of so many systems that weren't created in an internet era is the #1 thing that many of them are facing and working on.
I want to hear from Mike on public-private partnerships, but just a quick follow-up, Andy. What do you think the cost of upgrading for a typical utility company is to address some of these?
I'm going to be very quick. It ranges massively.
It ranges massively?
Yeah, and again, if you think of the answer about the size that they have, the amount of assets that they are responsible for, I won't even hazard to put a dollar figure on it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Mike, anything you wanted to add on?
Sure. On sharing information?
Sure.
We have the NCI-JTF, which is our National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, which a number of intelligence community partners, DHS, and a number of entities come to share intelligence, and that can be at different levels of classification. And then I'm a part of a unit. We're based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we have a number of industry partners co-located with our little FBI Cyber Division unit. So I could walk down the hall and talk to a number of different folks from large financial institutions, large retailers, and industry experts. We're right down the road from Carnegie Mellon Cert CC, as we talked about earlier, so we can see we have that facility available to us. We have two FBI personnel assigned out there to see the threats that are coming in real time. And again, I know I keep saying it, but going back to the real-time information sharing of the indicators that we see. And we're cognizant of the fact that it should be within a sector, but sometimes across a sector. So we have to be aware that the telecommunications sector may tell us a problem that they're seeing that affects a power grid or affects another entity. We've definitely seen that with the telecommunications sector, giving preemptive notification to the financial sector, let's say. So I think that trusted sharing relationship, it has to be built over time. And NCI-JTF, our InfoGuard program, as well as working with DHS, and experts like CERT CC and US CERT is very helpful for us to get the big picture. But then the facilities to share that real time, that's a trusted relationship that builds over a couple years.
Makes sense.
And I think I have a comment for that, for the trust relationship between private companies and also with security researchers. We have a US CERT, ICS CERT, but when it comes to private companies, if they come across research that exposes or finds vulnerabilities, there was some legislation that was proposed, actually it's been going on since 2012, to give that company civil protection. So if they were to go to the US government, excuse me, and say, like, we found these vulnerabilities, the trust relationship between the private companies and the government would be established so that they feel comfortable about saying, hey, we found this, we were doing some red teams, like research. We'd like to let the government know we found these types of vulnerabilities without whoever the vendor is that the government may be using, I guess getting upset about the vulnerabilities or how it was found. But this type of information sharing is quite important because getting people to come forward and companies to come forward with information that they have and trusting that they can still protect some of their IP as they come forward and share this is very important. And I think that some legislation that was pending, this part of it was significant for private industry.
Tiffany, let me ask you, how do consumer expectations about service and reliability play into this? I mean, security can slow services. That can make companies reluctant, but how does that all play in your view?
And there's always a trade-off between security and convenience. And when we have our bring our own device to work type of thing, there are vulnerabilities that can be exploited in someone's home and then bring it right into the corporate network. So the convenience versus security is always going to exist. So when it comes to that type of trade-off, what I suggest, and I'm a university professor teaching in a computer science department, is I teach my students to think like hackers. And while that may sound scary to some, we're graduating students where they're writing code and they're considering the security implications of every line of code they write. It's not anymore how fast does the algorithm run. That is important as well. But how secure is the stuff that you're producing? So when those students graduate and they go out into the workforce and work for all of you in private industry, they are designing things that are more secure. And we like to think that this is going to be changing through the graduates that we have in the United States taking jobs here in the US. The convenience versus security thing, maybe they'll raise their hand in company meetings and say, hey, I think there's a different way that we can do this that would make it better and more secure.
Andy?
Yeah, sure. I just want to say that when we're speaking about the development and whether it's commercial or on the industrial side of new products, new capabilities, of paramount interest, I think, is a concept called secure or security by design. The idea that if you have legacy equipment and some of the power system stuff is 20, 30, 40 years old, then you do what you can to isolate it and protect it from threats. But if you're building something new, you have a tremendous opportunity, whether it's an Internet of Things device, the next version of a cell phone, et cetera, you don't want security to dominate the functional requirements, otherwise nobody can, nobody will use it or sell it, right? But if there can be a little bit, if there can be a security voice at the table when you're in design discussions, and a design decision could go one way or another that could make security down the road demonstrably better or much tougher, it's nice to get the security person. I'd say we really need to get the security voice into those early design and development decisions, and that's power and everything.
Let me get in a question from the audience here.
Yeah, so I have a quick question. It's actually from Bob, our general manager, raised the point, and I want to hear a little bit more about it too. So you're just talking about how you're teaching, and so what are some of the eyebrow-raising things that you're seeing from your students or from people at DEF CON and Black Hat? You yourself, hacked into this jail to open, prove you could open the cell. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the eyebrow-raising things you're seeing?
We didn't hack into the jail. This is one of the, I'm also an attorney, so one of the things that we also balance with the research is where do we not cross the line between perhaps some research that may be controversial in that way. But it was a proof of concept that we never released. But that's one of the things that we look at the university and at DEF CON is how the interconnectedness, the Internet of Things, as you were mentioning, is really, it's coming so fast, and the computing power is increasing so greatly. The amount of devices that we all have with us and carry with us today, and we drive home in these cars that are mostly computers, not as much mechanical anymore. The security research community really is trying to catch up with what exists, and we're trying to find these vulnerabilities to let the companies and the government know when we find them as well about these problems that could be quite critical.
I guess what are some of the proof of concepts that have happened? I mean,
transportation.
And transportation.
That's been a big one with car security research with Charlie Miller and Chris Velasek presenting at Black Hat and DEF CON over the past 2 years. So transportation research, and I'm not just talking about consumer vehicles, but trains, trucks, planes. So there are people looking at these, how these systems have networks and how they're connected to the internet and other things.
We possess competence most people only imagine. We're at the forefront of the science that makes things real, and we're available when it matters most. It's why we're always thinking about new ways to create, create, and and building the most advanced fighter the world has ever seen.
Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Cecilia Kang. I am a technology reporter for the Washington Post, and I am joined by Eric Friedberg, who is the executive chairman of Stroz Friedberg. That is a global investigations, intelligence, and risk services firm based in New York, but with offices in Washington and other places. He has 20 years of government and private sector experience in cybercrime. Prior to his tenure at Stroz Friedberg, he was an assistant U.S. attorney for 11, and his office is calling, was assistant U.S. attorney for 11 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York, where he served as the lead cybercrime prosecutor. I'm also joined by Philip Reidinger, who was between 2009 and 2011 the Deputy Undersecretary for the National Protection and Programs Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security. He has also served as Sony's Chief Information Security Officer, the Chief Trustworthy Infrastructure Strategist at Microsoft as well. Thank you so much for joining us in this panel as we look at how companies are being affected. And I wanted to just quickly run down a list of what's happened in just the last few days that did not make the headlines that really is undercover, but really has become the norm. Here are some of the companies that have been hit by security breaches, data breaches. SuperValue, a grocery chain store. Jimmy John's, the sandwich shop chain, 216 locations hit. American Family Care, 2,500 patients with their data potentially at risk. Sheplers, a cowboy boot and western wear chain in the Midwest and Southwest, was also hit. The point of this is to say that many of the biggest companies get the headlines, and we hear and talk a lot about the breaches that occur at places like Target and Home Depot and Bank of America, and there is a general feeling of panic and a feeling of concern that consumers get. But there are countless other examples of data breaches that happen at companies that run the gamut in terms of size and industry. And we wanted to talk a little bit about the whole ecosystem. What is really happening here in the commercial sector? So I was hoping to start out, Eric, by asking you, what's going on? Is the problem actually getting worse? Is security actually becoming a bigger problem for companies now? Where is sort of the state of security in corporate America?
So when Stroz Friedberg is responding to these kinds of attacks, what we're seeing is that the problem is getting worse. And the problem is getting worse in part because the scope of the attacks has gotten enormous. Companies are experiencing intrusions where 100, 200, 300, 500 servers are being compromised, possibly for a small attack, possibly for a large attack in terms of the amount of information that's taken out of the network, but the scope of the machines affected is so enormous that the cost is rising into the $5, $10, $20 million range, just in terms of hard costs. And then there can be reputational costs that run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. So from a corporate governance perspective, it's very hard for companies in advance to prepare themselves for that level of attack.
I'd love to talk a little bit as we go on, get further into conversation about what that means for a small company if you're hit in that way and suffering those kinds of attacks or costs. Philip, what right now in your mind currently is the biggest problem or issue when it comes to corporate security?
Well, the biggest problem with regard to corporate security is actually the biggest problem with regard to critical infrastructure security and government security. And that is that the underlying paradigm of the internet right now is that offense wins. And that doesn't mean that every attack succeeds. It means that over a period of time, somebody devoting enough resources to get into your networks, given the size of the attack surface areas and the underlying vulnerabilities of the infrastructure, will, as a normal course, be able to do that. And so as a result of that, you see these sorts of series of breaches, more and more reports of breaches. And that's breaches. That doesn't deal with the underlying loss of intellectual property and government secrets and other things that often take place, which leads to what Eric was talking about. The problem is, in fact, getting worse. The defenders are getting better. The defense curve is going up, but the attack curve, I think, is going up more steeply because they're good at sharing information, they're getting better, there are more of them, and there's more information available and valuable online. So we're all looking for that point where those curves start to come together again, but we haven't hit that moment yet. And we may not see it for a considerable period of time, depending upon what happens.
Eric, do you have any thoughts on that? What you think today is the biggest problem?
I think that Phil is absolutely right. It's a cat and mouse game where companies are often playing catch up. And so I get back to the issue of what can they do is you have to increase your corporate governance around these issues. Top management has to own cybersecurity threat and put budget behind it, put the right people behind it, put technology behind it to establish a corporate culture of security. And so that's a big challenge because often that involves substantial change management. If, for example, in a company, the sales function has been predominant because you're a sales organization, and as I think one of the panelists previously said, security equals 1 over convenience, so it's inversely proportional convenience. The sales culture might drive convenience-oriented solutions that at the cost of better security. Well, upper management has to take those reins and drive security from the top. And so the good news is that one of the things that corporations can do to become a better secured environment is to excel at something within their control, which is corporate governance around cyber. If you don't have that, bad security. If you have it, you have a better chance.
So let's put on the hat of a top manager. Do they need to know who is attacking? If you are a company in the US, say you're this Western wear company, say you make cereal, say you whatever, let's sort of back up and talk about who is attacking actually. Can you give us sort of a framework on what do these attackers want from US companies and who are they? Eric.
Sure. Well, there's 4 basic buckets. There's state-sponsored agents that typically want intellectual property, research and development, formulas, industrial know-how. There are Russian, not just Russian, but organized crime groups that are after financial information. They want to wire transfer money out. They want to move money. They want to steal money. They want to steal credit cards. They're financially motivated. Then there are hacktivists, politically organized groups or state-sponsored groups that are looking to cause embarrassment, data destruction, data corruption. And then there's corrupt or negligent insiders. And those are the 4 buckets. And if you're a corporate victim, it very much matters how in advance what your threat profile is. Because, for example, if you're a food manufacturer, it's unlikely that a state-sponsored agent is going to come after you to steal intellectual property. The reason that matters is because you have to prioritize your security spend. So you can't prioritize your security spend unless you know what your threat profile is. So one of the chief things that you do in a corporate governance situation is to figure out what are your likely threats and how do you align your security spend, which isn't unlimited, with those threats.
Philip, can you piggyback on that a little bit? Do you think it matters who is attacking you, who might be attacking you as a company, depending on what industry you're in?
Well, who is attacking you can be important, particularly if that drives indicators that you would use to look for to stop an attack. But as a general matter, in terms of prevention, no, thinking about what the threats are, the taxonomy that Eric talked about. Scott Charney at Microsoft also did a paper recently that used a similar taxonomy. I might give a slightly different cut on it, which is, I think, supplementary to and not conflicting of Eric's. You can think about it as attackers may come after you because of what you know or what you've got. So your valuable sources of data, anything that they could take from you, which might be credit card data, it might be intellectual property, might be pre-release content, any of those things. They might come after you because of who you are. Not that they want to take something from you, but because they want to take you down for some political or other purpose. And then the last place, and this is something that's just starting to become, I think, more apparent, they may try to take you down not because of what you know or who you are, but who you know. So it might be that you are a third party to somebody else that they actually want to get access to. And so you might be a means to an end, and you actually see this more regularly. End users are taken down sometimes not because hackers want the data on their computer, they just want access to the computer to use it for all sorts of purposes, even if it's as simple as use on a botnet. So there's a broad spectrum of attackers, and you really have to, if you have the capability managed for risk, figure out what you want to try to protect, what are your most valuable assets.
Phil, why are companies struggling in this? What's going on?
Well, I mean, why they're struggling is exactly what we talked about before. This is getting harder and harder to do. It takes a lot of resources. Eric is quite right. You need corporate governance. You need board attention to the matter. I think most boards really get it now. If they didn't before, things like Target have helped ramp up the level of attention. It turns out it's a really difficult area to make progress in. We're getting better and better technologies, but it can be very difficult to deploy them. A lot of our technologies don't scale well. And that means that if you can't solve a problem completely with technology, you've got to have the right people. I mean, there's a lot of this that is a people problem, and there aren't enough of those people. They're really hard to get. Many of us in this space that have been around for a while, our biggest job is actually to find the good people that our friends have and try and steal them.
Resources is a big issue. We're very fortunate to have questions submitted by email and social media. Allison has several questions queued up. Let's take a first one.
Yeah, sure. So this, building on this, there's a question that came in through email about what's the sort of right scale of partnership between the government and industries? Is it global? Is it local? Is it based on sectors? Is it across sectors? What would help companies and corporations the most?
Who wants to take this? Eric, you want to take this first and then Philip?
Sure. Most companies try to build local relationships with cyber agents at either FBI or Secret Service, so that they have in their incident response plan an initial contact, so that there is a breach, they know who to reach out to, and they can get them right away. The main challenge is for us as critical incident responders is what corporations need from law enforcement, not on day 20, not on day 40, or not on day 60, but what we need on day 1 or day 2 is a set of indicators of compromise, the IP addresses, the hash values, the file names that law enforcement and the intelligence community know are associated with this type of attack on this sector of industry. And there's a real strain going on right now in the speed at which private incident responders are able to get that information from the government.
Let's get a little check on that. So today, when is a company getting that information? Is it on day 20? Is it on day 5? Just generally, what can a company expect today from law enforcement and government?
The problem is it's spotty. If you get the right group at FBI or Secret Service, the right circumstances, nobody takes the wrong view about whether or not the information that they're going to provide is classified and therefore can't be provided. If all that stuff lines up, you get good indicators, which you could then search the corporate network, and it speeds your response. But if you don't get the right circumstances, the information is quite delayed, or it doesn't happen.
Philip?
Eric's exactly right. I mean, to answer the question a little bit more broadly, you do need global partnerships. You want to be a friend to everybody you can, because if they give you valuable data, that's a wonderful thing. And what you really want is, as Eric said, you want actionable data. You want indicators. You want things that you can use to increase your security right now. And the real problem is that it's actually, I would add to what Eric said, it's not just that our human relationships don't work fast enough. It's that our human relationships, in addition, while we want them to work faster, can't work fast enough. And we need to build out automated information sharing and indicator sharing mechanisms that work on internet speed, because the attacker's attack circle, turning circle, is tighter than ours. And only if we're able as defenders to operate at internet speed, find out about an attack, a new 0-day, whatever, and spread that broadly through the network, will we be able to do things like protect critical infrastructure to the degree we need to.
I mean, one thing that's happening is, in order to deal with that lag of information from the government, private groups have cropped up, such as the FSISAC, and now there's a growing group of retail organizations trying to form a retail ISAC. And so CISOs and head of cyber from various financial institutions, for example, in the FSISAC, will trade on an immediate phone call indicators of compromise, so that, let's say you're Bank A and you've been attacked, you call your friend at Bank B, and on day 1, you can get from Bank B that had that same attack a week and a half ago or a month ago, useful information that gets transmitted immediately. Then you turn around and you search for those indicators within your network, and you say, oh, well, those indicators have now led me to the fact that I have these 20 machines compromised, and now you're off to the races with forensics. That's the way it should work. And I think that's the way government wants it to work, and certainly the executive order is asked for that government to respond in that fashion, but it hasn't gotten there yet.
And
just a quick, just to drop, let's also give some credit where credit is due. I think the FSISAC does great work. The ISACs actually grew out of government initiatives and were supported by their establishment. While they were established by the private sector, were supported by government, and the original idea came actually from the President Clinton's executive order back in 1997. So that's how old this is. That, back then it was a single ISAC, it grew into a set of ISACs. So that is a place where I think government has played a favorable role.
Agree.
Does this sort of coordination, does this touch on smaller companies though? Is it, if you're just a Fortune 500, are you involved in these sorts of this sort of cooperation?
I think it varies somewhat, but for example, my understanding, I've never worked for a financial services company, but the Financial Services ISAC, for example, I believe has a tiered membership structure, and it's actually quite inexpensive for smaller companies to participate. And if they participate, they get full access to the data that's being shared. So those channels are available. The problem a smaller company may be likely to have is, what are they going to do with that information? How can they consume it? That's a very difficult problem.
Philip, you mentioned the role that the government has played in forming this sort of coordinating body. What policies could and should be put in place? What can government, in other words, do to help with this growing threat of cybersecurity?
So I will give you 3 top things I think the government needs to do. I think the government needs to really ensure that, particularly in critical infrastructure, the right requirements are being met. And that doesn't mean massive new regulation everywhere, but it means we at least need stronger incentives to get especially critical infrastructure to invest the right amount in security in different places. I think it needs to continue to work a lot on the people problem. There's some great initiatives like Cyber Aces to increase the amount of cybersecurity talent we've got, but I mentioned before, we're all stealing people from other people. You can't hire enough people in this space, so we've got to tackle that.
And are they being trained and educated here, or are they overseas?
Well, people are being trained all over the place, and we're training far fewer people in the United States than are some other countries. And the last thing, this goes back to what the director of DARPA was talking about. We just need a fundamentally more secure infrastructure. We've gotten really good at building more secure houses based on an infrastructure that's sand, right? But that infrastructure is still sand, and that's got to be changed, at least over time. Otherwise, it's all just a bunch of Band-Aids, to mix metaphors.
Eric, if you had a wish list from government, what would that include?
I think they have made a very good progress at the beginning in trying to build public-private relationships, and I think there needs to be more consistency across the platform when we talk about threat information sharing. Private industry is very hungry for threat information, and the White House has clearly indicated with the executive order that it's a mandate that this information should be shared. And I think moving down that road, as they have continued to do, would be a positive thing.
Right. Let's take another question from email or social media.
Yeah, so this one came from Twitter, actually. If, as a company, you're assuming that you're going to be breached, what does that mean for insurers? And it relates to this idea of, if you're meeting a government standard, or an imposed standard, what does it mean for insurance, and what's the cost of insurance?
But I think insurance is a really hard problem. I know we're almost out of time. People have been talking about cyber insurance since 1995, but if you watch the earlier panels, you saw John Carlin and Chris Painter talk about the fact that there's no actuarial level data in this space that would enable you to effectively judge what's effective. So I think insurance can be important, but we actually need much more security science. We need more data about what's happening. We need more data about what is effective to really enable an insurance market to drive the additional security that everyone wants.
Eric, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I see this play out quite regularly, because post-response, there's usually a claim under cyber insurance policies. So these cyber insurance policies are working. The claims are being submitted. Insurance companies are paying out. The problem that Phil is referring to is the underwriting industry doesn't know how to handle the entire ball of risk. And so they're underwriting a fairly small portion of the market right now because they don't have underwriting standards. As more data comes in, they will develop those underwriting standards, and a broader set of insurance, especially with respect to consequential harm, will be available.
Right. We are unfortunately running out of time. I'm just going to ask one quick wrap-up question. Top 2 or 3 things that you recommend practically for a company to do right when you go into that office, the top managers?
So the first thing is increase your cyber governance. Second thing is, as Phil is saying, invest in people with specialized skills relating to cyber response. Third thing is be very careful about the types of intrusion detection that you select. There's many products out there. You have to be very careful about it. And those are really the top 3 things.
Great. Philip?
I'll repeat one of them. If nothing else, get the right person or people. 2, find solutions at scale. It's very difficult to approach this problem at scale, and so you need to get something that will allow you to address the security of your enterprise without increasing the complexity.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric and Philip, for joining us today, talking a little bit about what it's like from the perspective of somebody who understands the hacker and tries to consult with companies on how to be best protected. Please join me in welcoming and thanking them for joining us.
Thank you, Cecilia. And so we're going to continue talking about companies and the consumer. It seems like every day you open the paper. I'm going to welcome our next cyber panel up. But every day we open the paper and, you know, another few million credit cards have been stolen. And so we've assembled these experts actually from all over the United States to talk about what it means. That injury happened before she came in. Thank you, Ellen. It's not a cyber warrior thing out there. But I'm Mary Jordan, and again, from the Washington Post, and thank you for all the people that have been sending in comments online and watching online. Now we're going to continue about I'll introduce the panel in a second, but what does this all mean when you open the paper and you see yet another big company's been hacked and our credit cards have been stolen? So next to me is Jane Hall-Lute. She's the president and chief executive officer of the Council on Cybersecurity. And before that, she was a huge deal at the Department of Homeland Security. Actually, she was a deputy secretary there. So thanks for coming, Jane. Next to Jane is Brian Dodge. He's an executive vice president at the Retail Industry Leaders Association. So that association represents, you know, all the big players in retail from Walmart to Gap. So thanks, Brian, for coming. And then we have Erin Jacobs. She's a managing partner at Urbane Security. It's a security firm in Chicago. And she is the one who goes in and undercovers vulnerabilities in a company. So you need people like Erin around. And then we have Ellen Ritchie. She's the executive vice president, chief legal officer, and also the chief enterprise officer for Visa. And she's responsible for all the compliance, audit, and risk teams of that huge credit card company. So let's start. What does it mean when we keep hearing, first of all, who is paying? When I see that Home Depot just got hit 56 million cards or some other company, like what is the damage? I don't quite get the significance. So, you want to start, Jane?
I can start. I don't work for Home Depot. What's happening? What's happening is basically we are experiencing firsthand now in a public setting what companies have been experiencing for a dozen years or more. There is no company that has not been hacked, that hasn't been intruded, that has not had to deal with it. But in the past, I think most companies have dealt with this as kind of the price of doing business or a nuisance. And those times have changed. I mean, you know, in 1995, there were 16 million of us online. Today, there are 3 billion people online on the planet, 3 billion people online. So these acts now are much more public and more consequential.
So you represent the Retail Association. What is the consequence of these breaches?
Well, I think Jane's done a really good job of setting sort of context for this issue because it is a huge challenge, an enormous challenge. These are criminals who are very sophisticated and dedicated to trying to infiltrate systems for all businesses, and it's not unique to any one industry. In terms of what the impact is, it's obviously significant. There's an enormous brand risk to the businesses that are hacked when infiltrations occur. And the cost, ultimately, is something that's shared between all the players. When you talk about card, counterfeit, fraudulent charges as related to card issues, it's shared between merchants, banks, and the institutions across the payments ecosystem, which is why we have argued that the solution to these problems is one where all those players work together. There's skin in the game across the ecosystem, and we need to be working together towards those solutions.
But companies are worried about this because you say brand risk. I mean, people are worried about turning over their credit card numbers.
Absolutely. I mean, if the intensity of the conversations going on in every boardroom, and I think probably folks up here can speak to that, the intensity of the conversation around this issue and how businesses are adapting to the expansion of this risk, I think are really intense right now.
And Erin, do you want to talk about technically how it works? So there's a big company, somebody goes in and steals millions of credit cards. just talk how they do that, and then what the end game is here. They actually often just resell those credit card numbers.
Right. Now, there could be an encyclopedia of different ways that people get into systems, especially in retail. And where we're seeing it with credit card, obviously, is that there's a monetization to credit cards. There's a reason why people want those numbers. They're easy for them to use right now. And there's a black market solely on the distribution of credit card information, for vast amounts of use, from just criminals all the way to, foreign entities. And so in regards to how people are going about getting in, I mean, we're wiping off the doormat in a lot of cases. I mean, companies have scaled in the last 20 years a gigantic amount. And so what hasn't scaled is their infrastructure. And a lot of the technology and education hasn't gotten built up. So we haven't really formulated our roots to how to create secure corporate environments from retail to corporations that are trying to protect intellectual property. The only difference is with credit card information, payment information, there is monetization, whereas with social security numbers and all these other data bits that we're storing, we just haven't quite found the black markets that want to pay premium.
And how does the black market work? So you go in, you turn it around, and then you use the internet to sell them again? And then somebody buys them and buys a pair of $200 shoes? I mean, tell me how it actually plays out, because
there are far better experts on the black market and the dark net than I am, and so I'm not even going to touch that right now. But yeah,
Ellen?
Well, this is secondhand information. I myself do not frequent these sites, but there are sites. They're primarily housed in Eastern Europe, where credit card information and debit card information, card numbers, fully equipped cards, cards with pins, the whole 9 yards, are available. They sell for different prices depending on the brand, depending on whether it's an affluent or a standard card, depending on whether the PIN is provided, depending on whether they give you enough information to do counterfeit. I mean, it's all quite out in the open, although I don't recommend looking for them and going on them, because like other underground sites, if you're not kind of known within that community, they might, offensively come back at you. So I don't recommend going and looking for them, but it's a very open and notorious market. And the cards might sell, card information might sell for anything from $3 or $4 to $30 or $40, or even upwards to $100 for the information for a fully equipped card with PIN.
And then if you sell millions, you get $100 for each one, and so you're making some money.
Absolutely right. But I want to come back to your first question.
Okay.
All
right, let's go back.
In terms of who pays and what happens when this breach might occur, wherever it might be. The first thing is it's not, that everybody needs to be clear on. Here in the U.S., it is never the consumer, or only very rarely the consumer, that suffers any financial loss. And that's because here in the U.S. we have a zero liability policy that I'm sure you've all heard about, and your bank will take the charges off if they're unauthorized charges. So number one, it's not the consumer, and as Brian was saying, it has to do with within the industry who's going to pay. So the second thing I wanted to say is, as soon as one of these breaches is identified, and they're often identified by the banks themselves or by law enforcement, difficult often for the breached entity to detect it themselves, which is a topic that Aaron might want to comment on. So once it's identified, this huge machinery goes into place where the payment brands, such as ourselves and our competitors, get the information about the accounts that might have gone through that environment. And we get that information out to your banks. As consumers, you know that your bank has that information and can either monitor your account with special scoring because they know it's been exposed and protect you from the fraud, or reissue your account. And all that happens in the first instance by the banks. Then later, there's some provision for sharing the cost among the other players. So that's kind of my answer to your first question.
Jane, do you have anything to add to that about, do the consumers in the end?
I mean, Ellen's, it's right in terms of liability, but ultimately consumers do bear the costs of the perturbations of the marketplace. I mean, that's, one way or another. I mean, all of these companies that are represented by Brian's organization and Ellen certainly, I mean, we love the market for a reason. They're in the market to make money, though. So this is going to be cost that's transferred ultimately to the consumer. But I want to come back to sort of the basic theory of the case that underlies this. I mean, there are plenty of bad things that are happening out there in cyberspace, but they're happening in the face of an obvious capacity to act. We know what to do for basic cyber hygiene. We're just not doing it. And pick your number. I mean, experts, and I'm not a technologist, but I hang around those who are, And they'll say these basic hygiene will prevent 80 to 90% of all known attacks.
Let's
today.
just go through it fast.
Do you know what's connected to your network? Do you know what's running or trying to run on your network? Do you know who has administrative permissions to change, bypass, or override your configurations? And do you have an automated system in place like DHS's continuous diagnostics and mitigation that allows you to be alert to vulnerabilities when they happen and patch them and take appropriate remediative action? I mean, those basic, sort of the top 5 of the 20 critical security controls constitute basic hygiene. We're broadly not doing it, and there's no excuse now for why we're not.
And I think, Ellen, you said that 6 cents of every $100
I was going to comment on that. So in terms of what the cost really is, so the cost of fraud to the payment system in Visa's system is less than 6 cents for every $100, which is why I believe that it has been treated to a large extent up until now, as Jane was saying, as business as usual, was changed, I think, starting last Christmas because of the prominence of the breaches that occurred then at that time of year and affecting so many people, is that it's become more a question of trust and confidence in the system, which has created a kind of unanimity, I think, that hasn't existed before, at least let's say a consensus that we need to move forward in the payment system to take the vulnerable data out of the system, and we have the means to do that, at least to take it out of the merchant environment. Now, because it's such a complex and extensive environment, it's going to take some time. But moving forward, for example, on the EMV chip rollout, and moving forward with some solutions for the internet shopping and the mobile shopping that you saw, for example, with the recent announcement from Apple Pay, which uses tokenization technology provided by the payment system. So all those things will take the data out.
So let's take one at a time here. So let's talk about Apple Pay. I mean, it's just shocking. I mean, almost everybody now shops or puts their credit card online. The future of online consumer activity, how is it going to be more secure? And what do you think of the Apple system?
Sure. So let me break it apart a little bit. First, I have no doubt the technology and the systems that Jane is talking about would improve systems, and hopefully we'll see more of that. But there is no silver bullet. And I think what we have argued is that you need layers of security. And Ellen has hit upon some important aspects of it. How do we we talked about the card information showing up on the black market and being monetized. We need to make sure that if a criminal were able to get a hold of this information, it would ultimately be useless. They wouldn't be able to.
And how do you
sell
do
it.
that?
That's some of the technology we've talked about here, right? So moving to chip cards, merchants have argued strenuously that those cards should also be issued with PIN numbers so that you have authentication of the card and also the person with the card. We feel very strongly about that. But tokenization, which is what we believe is an underpinning of Apple Pay, is also a very terrific long-term solution that would, instead of transmitting information related to the 16 digits on your card, expiration date, and so forth, you transmit something else that, if intercepted, couldn't be monetized, couldn't be sold, or couldn't lead to fraud.
But I want to just come to this point that Brian made, and he's of course right. I don't mean to represent the controls, sort of as the be-all and end-all. I mean, nothing, solves a problem to 100%. I mean, but because you are going to get a cold at some point in your lifetime, does that mean you're not going to wash your hands? I mean, because you're going to be in a traffic accident, does that mean you don't buckle your seatbelt? I mean, this is basic preventive hygiene that we're not doing in anything approaching a systematic way. And we're all on the same net.
And you talked a lot about the hygiene for a company. How about a consumer, just a regular person? What are they supposed to do to protect their identity and their card numbers? And
the standard things that we have, is secure passwords, and now your computer will generate them for you. But we're not always on that computer generating them, and we all don't keep them in our keychain. Two-factor authentication, the kinds of innovations that Ellen was describing, are the future. In fact, they are the present for certain of us who have access to certain systems. Would you share your toothbrush? Don't share your password. Let's use some common sense things. And do you know who's getting on your networks at home? Pay attention. Secure it.
Let's just go back to the future.
Let me add one thing for you consumers. It's a shocking thing in today's world, the sharing of your personal information. If you wanted, you could probably know my birthday, my mother's maiden name, my first pet, where I went to high school, my favorite teacher, all those things that they ask you on the security questions and that you use in your password, right? So in case you want to know, my password is not 0316, my birthday, but I have met a lot of people who use that, not that one, but their own, and that is surprisingly easy for the criminals to fish and find from you or detect from you on social networks. I didn't think it would be worth their trouble, but it is. They find that stuff out about you, so watch out for oversharing.
What's a clever password? You want to tell us? That was a joke.
Actually, I wanted to add to that because I think it's very valuable to say, you know, be careful what you share on social networks. But I have a lot of friends in the security industry that are like, I'm not on any social networks. You know, I don't do that. Guess what? Their wives, their friends, their family, their kids, they are, and they're telling everything about them. And also, you know, our system in the U.S. doesn't help because we have so much public domain information. For a long time, I never shared my address. But guess what? You know, title companies and all this, there's a lot of public information around real estate sales and purchases that's just public. Now, I'm not the type of person that's going to say that everything needs to be private, but I think we need to do personal, from a consumer side, a risk assessment of our own information and understand what's important to us and what we're willing to share and what we're not. We're talking about passwords, and I think that's fantastic because nobody's doing passwords correctly. Nobody's making complex passwords correctly, and I know, I can guarantee everybody in this room, there's not a single person that's using a unique password on everything they log into. I'm sure there's a shared password. It might be complex, but I'm sure it's shared.
But if you're not a technologist, I mean, this is all the voodoo that you do in that space. And it's, those of us who are not technologists want to know what are the most important things that we can do first, measurably reduce our vulnerability.
Yeah, lock your door. I mean, that's what I say, and I say it in a kind of a home sense, but you know, we're talking about Apple Pay. We're talking, and Apple Pay is not the first. Google's had the same technology prior.
You have faith in Apple Pay. You think it will be?
No, don't put those words in my mouth.
What do you think of Apple Pay?
I think Apple Pay, I think EMV, I think these are all little pivots to start turning this big Titanic we have. I think they're going to help.
Pivots towards more security.
Pivots towards taking a little bit of the risk out of the environment. EMV, to the chips that we're putting on things, I mean, that's a card-present transaction item. So instead of swiping your card, it has a chip. So instead of all that mag strip going across and being able to be harvested, it can be there. It's, you know, it's limited. Now the chip has the same information aside from, you know, one component. So again,
but if it's stolen, it's less valuable, right? I mean, that's why the chip and pin system is supposed to be more secure.
Right.
If it's stolen, the chip is a little computer on the card, as I'm sure many of you know. It generates a one-time use code. So without that code, which is different for every transaction, you can't complete a transaction. So unless you have the little computer itself, the chip, you can't complete a transaction with all the rest of that information in the face-to-face environment. We need to add the solution for the online environment.
But this raises the whole question, I think, about how are we going to distribute responsibility for cybersecurity? What do we rightly want to give to the consumers? What responsibility should you have? I mean, when you drive a car, or you're a passenger, or you're a pedestrian, you have certain responsibilities for interacting in the literally trillions of automotive transactions that happen every single day. What expectations should we give to manufacturers? I mean, why don't we get systems shipped with the security configuration switched on? I mean, why do we all have to figure this out for ourselves? A lot is really
Can you
known.
answer your questions there? What is the responsibility for the retailer and for the consumer and for the credit card company?
You know, I think there are kind of three basic questions that are, to me, most interesting when it comes to cybersecurity. Question number one, how do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? Question number two, how do we ensure the integrity of our information and our identity in an open internet? We talked about privacy. Data integrity is a big problem. My blood type is A positive. There, it's out there. It's been out there. I don't care if you know it. I do care if you can change it. And how do we ensure the integrity of our information and our identity in an open, not closed internet? And number three is, what will the role of government be as we distribute responsibility? I mean, Ellen described an industry that's taking ever more responsibility for trying to get ahead of the curve. Brian, likewise. I mean, what we're facing, though, is a lack of a conversation. We've had industry fighting the security problem, saying, no, Brian, you said this, but you didn't mean it in this way. There are no silver bullets. Nothing will do all that needs doing. But for goodness sake, Thank goodness the medical community and the public safety community didn't take that attitude. They've mainstreamed prevention. Let's prevent what we can at costs we can afford. That will reduce the noise level in the threat space and allow important, complex companies to focus precious resources on those advanced persistent threats. But we're not even making it hard right now.
So on that, not even making it hard right now, why does Europe have a stronger credit card system than we do? The security there is, we have lagged behind. Why is that?
So we've asked that same question for a long time, and that's an area of tension.
I'm happy to answer it for you,
That's an
Brian.
area of tension. Before you do, though, I want to acknowledge, though, that the solutions you're talking about, they can't happen in silos, right? We need to be working with each other. We need to be working with government. We need to be working between industries, which is something that we have done after many years of doing battle over a variety of things, and perhaps one that we'll go back and forth on now. But the financial services industry and the merchant community came together earlier this year to figure out, are there ways for us to truly work together? Because we represent the full length of the payments ecosystem, from the card networks to the big banks and small banks, all kinds of merchants. And so can we be talking about these near-term solutions that exist, chip, EMV, chip and PIN, look at tokenization, next generation, because there is no solution today that protects the networks for all transactions in all places. And so we can try to address the near-term solutions. Merchants have strenuously argued that that's chip with a PIN, so you're authenticating the card, so it's not a counterfeit card, and the person who's holding the card actually owns that card, really important aspect. And then two, tokenization, encryption, long-term view of the world moving online.
We are moving towards both of those, right? We are moving towards both of those
Well,
right now.
we're moving towards chip, but not chip and PIN, and I think we're moving towards encryption and tokenization, but we're not there yet.
Ellen?
Okay, so you asked a question about Europe, and the answer is this, that Europe started the chip rollout probably more than a decade, more like 15 years ago, in response to a particular problem they were having. And the problem was a highly elevated fraud rate versus what we had here in the United States. And it was driven in part by the fact that here in the US, we had a very efficient and reliable telecommunications system. And as a result, all of our transactions go what we call online, not online on the internet, but online through secure channels to the bank, every single one. You know, your Starbucks coffee goes to your bank for authorization in a millisecond and comes back. It's really getting authorized by automated systems. In Europe, the telecommunication systems at that time were not as reliable, and they were unable to use that online authorization with predictive analytics to identify suspicious transactions. So they were not using those solutions. As a result, their fraud rates were here, ours were here. They decided that because of the inability to bring everything online, they were going to use an offline solution, something like the chip that could function just in a conversation between your card and the terminal without needing to go back to the bank, okay? So that was the origin of the chip card in Europe. Meanwhile, here in the US, the predictive analytics got better and better and better, and the fraud rate dropped from like 18 basis points down to below 6, reduced by 2/3 using that system solution. So that was why it was like, well, why should we invest in chip and disrupt the market, which, by the way, is the most highly outfitted payment card market in the world. So more expensive, less benefit. That's why the US didn't do it. Now we're doing it. Visa led the way, thought we should do it starting in 2011. We put out a roadmap. And now with Target, we have more consensus. And I would note that at the same time, it is not a silver bullet in Europe. And they have now come over to the side of using the predictive analytics. They're better able now with telecommunications to do the online.
Two quick things. So predictive analytics also mean that if I go to Mexico, someone says, whoops, she's not in Washington, and we get a call, or
you could get a call, or today you might get a message that you can answer yes or no in instance, so much more efficient.
And how are the fraud rates now between Europe and the States? You were saying before it was like this.
They have evened out, and the U.S. now, being somewhat of a magnet for counterfeit fraud, has gotten ahead of Europe a little bit. So you're seeing them a little bit higher here in the U.S., but kind of neck and neck.
Right. Okay, so great. We're going to go to the audience questions. Sorry.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of them.
Okay.
So one is, if a company outsources all of its credit card processing, are they required to be compliant? Who's overseeing that? Who wants to take that question?
Yes, so I think the questioner is referring to compliance with our payment card industry data security standards. And absolutely yes, outsourced processors are required to be compliant, and other service providers as well that handle payment card data. Any company that stores, processes, or transmits payment card data.
Go ahead.
Another one, this is probably for Jane. Can digital hygiene education become a mandatory part of our education system, and how and where?
I mean, it can, but I think we need to treat the public as an asset, not an obstacle. We have a pretty prudent public. We have a pretty intelligent, pretty smart, pretty switched on, certainly pretty online public. And people will do sensible things when they know why. And so we've always tried to treat the public as an asset here. And yes, introduce education. We are the last generation that remembers what life is like before we were online. So comprehensively, there's nothing any of us, none of us negotiated our morning without interfacing online in some way. We have tremendous reliance. We might as well be smart and educated about it.
Does anyone here not do online payments? I mean, since you're also a cyber, it's
93% of the Belgian economy or consumer economy is done online. I mean that was a factoid I saw in Airline magazine. And it's random, but we're all. There isn't an enterprise in the United States that delivers value that doesn't rely on the internet and connectivity in some way. We have tremendous reliance. We ought to do basic hygiene. Again, to lower the noise level of the threats that are out there so that we can focus on those advanced persistent threats with the resources they require.
And a few years from now, is it going to be different? I mean, it just strikes me as odd that online that you put your credit card number and your security code. I mean, if
So I think I want to build off a point made just a moment ago. So the migration, because chip and PIN rolled out in Europe has brought down fraud costs, no doubt about it. And now without it in the US, our fraud rates have gone up. I think building off of this point, in Europe, you've seen fraud migrate online. So they've hardened the systems around security related to a card-present transaction.
The face-to-face transaction.
And now it's moved online.
Right.
It's moved to the US and it's moved online.
Right.
And so we need to develop those stronger solutions. What you're describing as the existing solution is unacceptable. We need to evolve beyond that.
So what will it look like in a couple of years? Does anyone have an idea?
Well, a couple of things nobody knows exactly because this is a free market and we have to please the consumer as well as the retailers and make it work for the banks. But a couple of things happening right now. First is mobile. So you see Apple Pay, that's not the only thing. Right. You have your Google wallets, you have other types of wallet solutions. We have our Visa checkout, MasterCard has MasterPass, and so forth and so on. So those solutions all allow you to transact either in the mobile or the online environment with a cloud provider, actually, such as ourselves or others, handling the sensitive data in the background. Okay, so that's number one. I think you'll see more of a proliferation of that. So that's a solution that's both mobile and online. And then in the mobile environment, of course, you're seeing this idea that you can just with your fingerprint or with entering your code enable an application, a payment application that can be used both face-to-face, using, by the way, chip technology, but maybe a little too technical for this conversation, or in an application on your phone or on your iPad or on your other device, so that you will have a payment application that securely transmits the information without your doing anything other than your fingerprint or some other biometric identification to identify yourself. Very simple and clean.
As long as you don't disable that.
Yes.
Because it's really inconvenient to put your finger or a passcode on a phone. So.
And I think we need to embrace the innovation in this space. We need to make sure that it's preserved. There's lots of competition for these new technologies. I think from the merchant space, we're excited about what the prospect is for some of these technologies. We want to make sure that there's lots of players in the mix developing something new and trying to hold everybody else accountable for the better solution that may exist tomorrow.
And I think as shareholders and consumers, we need to start insisting, and ask for the performance record of companies on basic hygiene. Stand up in a meeting and say, we just had a tremendous breach. Did we know what was connected to the networks, what was running, who had administrative authority to change our settings? Do you have an automated system in place? We can start insisting on a higher standard in enterprise security performance.
Since you have advice for consumers, what do you tell them about, Jennifer Lawrence famously didn't like it when her nude photos went around the world. And so what should consumers do, especially when it comes to the cloud? and just their personal devices.
I mean, I think we're all, you know, we all don't need to touch the stove to know, you know, when it's hot to know you get burned. You know, Ellen mentioned some sensible practices, but also investigate where you are storing your information.
So where's a bad place to store it? And I guess, and Ellen, or Aaron, I want to go to you about what you don't do, because you practice this all the time, what you don't do.
Oh, I think it's a great question that you asked, because again, going back to what I said about a personal risk assessment, let's understand what's going to damage us. I mean, think of yourself as your own personal brand. I mean, Jennifer Lawrence and all these celebrities, what are you guys doing? A, taking these pictures on a mobile device or whatnot to begin with, much less putting it somewhere, you know, aside from on a Polaroid in your closet. I mean, it's not just that kind of information, though, but I think it's all these information. I mean, the people, we're talking 7 to 10 years ago, were still storing their tax return information in these cloud storage, I'm going to use my quotey fingers, cloud storage areas or online storage or on computers that had no security. That's all their information.
So the message is think of what would damage you if it was public and see where it's located and how locked it is.
But again, it's a distributed system of responsibility. We need to be smarter consumers, smarter citizens, you know, smarter members of society more broadly when it comes to being online. But we also have a right to expect that companies and enterprises with whom we share our data are taking the basic measures that we know prevent 90% of the stuff that's happening right now. They're not doing it. We ought to insist that they do.
You know,
last word from Ellen and then Brian, and then we'll have to wrap it up. Sorry.
Last word, since we're talking about consumers, you are protected financially to avoid the hassle. I would suggest one other thing you can do is sign up for alerts, real-time alerts from your bank. You can be in control of the use of your card. The minute anybody is using it improperly, you'll see it yourself, and you can be the one who notifies the bank.
It's an alert that tells you what? That, hey, you usually don't buy this? Or
no, an alert, well, you can set it however you want, but I set mine, any transaction over $25 outside the United States or online. I get a text and an email simultaneously, instantly, as soon as the transaction happens.
And then you call your kids and you say, what are you doing?
I say, why did you, really? $50 for a hot dog?
Got it. That's very interesting. Okay, yeah. Brian.
Just a level of commitment within the retail industry to make sure that their customers are safe. I mean, the activity that we've seen over the course of the last 9 months to build upon the processes they had in place before that has been extraordinary, from the partnership with the financial services industry, but also threat information sharing across retailers, a tool that has previously been for critical infrastructure, which retail is not, but taking lessons from that to make sure that we're hardening our systems in every way we possibly can.
All right. Thank you very, very, very much. Very interesting. I didn't know about all those alerts. I have 2 teenagers. I'm very excited about that. Okay, so I want to thank this panel, and then I want to welcome to the stage the final discussion of the day. I'm very lucky to have David Hoffman here. He is former foreign editor, former Moscow bureau chief, contributing writer and editor at the Washington Post. Also, he's won a Pulitzer for a book he wrote, and he's going to be interviewing Alejandro Mayorkas from the Department of Homeland Security. So I want to welcome them to the stage. David and Alejandro.
You ready? Where do you want me? Here. Ready. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm going to tell you a secret that nobody has told you yet today, which is in the old days when I first came to the Post, this is where they printed the newspaper. It was a giant press room. It was filled with ink flying around and people waiting out on the street to get the newspaper. And guess what? The digital age has come, and here we are in the digital age. Welcome. I'd like to introduce Alejandro. Alejandro Mayorkas is a native of Cuba, came to the United States when he was 1 year old, made his way to Los Angeles, earned an undergraduate degree from the University of California at Berkeley, a law degree from Loyola. After that rose to become Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Central District of California, a really big part of California that includes Los Angeles and a lot of other places. Was a lawyer with O'Melveny & Myers, a big firm, and in 2009 was appointed by the President as Director of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. And he was sworn in as Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, December 23rd of last year. So welcome. We know you've only been in office less than a year, but you know everything. So we're here to extract some of that information from you, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, David. Thank you.
You know, it's been a very, very discouraging kind of morning. While you were away, before you got here, we heard from a lot of people, and here's just a little bit of what they said. The chairman of the House Intelligence Committee warned us that the actions that are being taken from outside attacks on our networks are not necessarily aimed at the government, he said. It's not the government we're worried about. It's the 85% of the networks in the hands of the private sector that we're worried about. He said, they will not be ready. And he said, for a lot of those businessmen, our nose is just barely above water. Somebody else said here on an earlier panel, the defenders are getting better, but the attacker curve is more steep. Offense is winning. Somebody else described the infrastructure on the internet as really just a bunch of Band-Aids. And the chairman said, when asked about offensive attacks, he said, most of the offensive talk is from the private sector, from businessmen who said, I've had enough. And he pointed out to us that Congress has told the private sector, you're on your own. So, Mr. Secretary, that's a kind of a grim landscape of what we've heard this morning. But I think a lot of people are wondering, what is the government doing in this time of siege? And that word siege was also used here. Consumers, business, everybody, even Congress feels there's a crisis. What are you doing about it?
So let me say that I do not ascribe to a school of pessimism, and by that I don't mean to belittle the magnitude of the threat, both in terms of its gravity and its frequency of occurrence. I think everyone understands that cybersecurity is a field of growth with respect to the security of the government and with respect to the security of the private sector. I would take the alarm not as necessarily a cause for concern, but rather as a call to action. Because as my great predecessor, Jane Hall-Lute, spoke, there is a distribution of responsibility. I would posit, use a word different than distribution, I would say shared responsibility. While attackers are in fact becoming more and more sophisticated, our prevention capabilities are growing in sophistication, our detection capabilities are growing in sophistication, our response and remediation capabilities are escalating as well. The cyber threat is real, and I think it will be a growth industry. We in the government, specifically in the Department of Homeland Security, have a number of tools and resources to deploy to protect the .gov environment. I think we've seen some of those tools deployed admirably and effectively. For example, in the Heartbleed situation of a couple months ago, we work very closely. We use our capabilities to work very closely with the private sector, whether it's in the business of sharing information, whether it's in the business of deploying our expert teams, our U.S. CERT teams, to a particular company or a sector to identify vulnerabilities and to propose mitigation steps. I think the opportunities for collaboration and advancement are great.
You know, Mr. Secretary, you said in June, I think, that there was a real need for this legislation that would help companies and the government work more closely. A lot of companies are worried about the problem of liability, and yet Congress has been stalled on this question for a long while. I think just in the past few days, General Alexander said the chances of this legislation passing in a lame duck session are practically nil. And the chairman of the Intelligence Committee today said there's a very narrow window. If this legislation isn't passed, can the administration do this on its own?
So first of all, I'm hopeful that the legislation will pass, and the Secretary has been a very strong proponent of the need for that legislation, and he wrote a very compelling piece last week to that effect. In the absence of legislation, we are not without resource and without opportunity to do more in this space, to better collaborate with the private sector. As I heard the prior panels speak, there are very fundamental things that we can do to improve our cyber hygiene, and there are also very strategic investments that we can make on a longer-term basis to improve our cyber hygiene. So we are not without tools, but we do have a dire need for legislation to better equip us and the like.
I just wonder if one of the reasons why we aren't seeing progress on this, I mean, people are saying there's a crisis in the country, and yet Congress is enacting. Is one of the reasons that consumers don't take this seriously enough? You think the country politicians have just not heard the alarm? Why is it that after several years of debate, we can't even get the most basic legislation we need for this?
Well, I don't think it's a function, David, of consumers not taking it seriously enough. I think that the consumer, the public in general, having seen a number of attacks that have impacted quite a number of individuals around the country.
40 million at Target, 56 million at Home Depot.
Exactly. I think that they well understand the concern. Now, whether they are taking the most rudimentary steps to mitigate the realization of those concerns is a different step. But, you know, how often do people actually change their passwords? Every 60, every 90 days. But putting that aside, this is an area where some of the fixes are accessible. There's a great deal of debate within the private sector on some aspects of the legislation. For example, a liability protection is something about which there's not unanimity. So that might be a more controversial aspect of the legislation. But the need to provide the government with the recruitment and retention tools to attract and keep cyber talent, updating the FISMA statutes that are long outdated. These are, quite frankly, things that we should be able to accomplish through legislation quite readily.
I want to come back to some of those, but let me ask you too, there's been a lot of talk here today about the threat. And to borrow a question that was asked in an earlier panel, what keeps you up at night? What's at the top of your threat list in cybersecurity?
So I would say I don't look at the threat, and we don't look at the threat, I should say, as a monolithic one, that it's singular in identity. There is the threat of what I will describe as the traditional hacker that is out for commercial advantage or for purely disruptive effect. And then I think there is the threat from state action, state-sponsored action from a intelligence gathering security perspective. And I think that's a threat that we are very vigilant in addressing. What keeps me up at night are both.
Can you be more specific, though? I mean, I'm trying to visualize what you're talking about. Those are very generalized things. Yep. What really worries you? What could happen to us as a result of this threat? You're in charge of defending our security. It's not only about our government networks, it's also about things that touch us every day.
Absolutely. So our role is to assist the private sector and support the private sector and work with the private sector in protecting its security. We don't have the tools to alone guard the .com space, so I think that's a very important point. But we have seen distributed denial of services. There is, I think it's, I hope everyone understands that our country's critical infrastructure is increasingly intertwined with our cybersecurity. And the energy sector, for example, is very well aware of this and is really at the forefront of protecting itself from cyber attack. So many of our systems, so many of our capabilities are controlled through computer systems. I think it is how inextricably intertwined those two are that is our greatest concern.
So the grid's at the top of your list.
The grid is at the top of the list.
You mentioned tools. So suppose Congress said to you, what authorities do you need? We'll give you a wish list. What's at the top of your list? What do you want that you don't have?
So we would, I think the Department of Homeland Security's responsibilities within the government are well defined. I think the codification of those would be well received. The FISMA, the governing statutory scheme in this area, is something that needs to be updated. It's quite antiquated. The NIST, the National Security Framework, to have that codified, I think would be greatly advantageous to us. Our ability to hire and retain, to really recruit cyber talent. On one hand, we have a difficult time competing with the private sector because of the financial realities. On the other hand, we are advantaged, I think, I would respectfully submit, vis-a-vis the private sector because our mission is an extraordinary one. But our ability to really identify particular talent and recruit, those are some of the things that we include in our need for legislation.
I know there are a lot of questions from social media and from the floor, so to the question desk.
Yeah, I'm going to ask the first question, then I'm going to hand the mic over. On your last point, what sort of pay level does DHS need to recruit and retain top talent?
So I would say something because the pay level is probably not going to necessarily compete with some of the private sector companies. It's the opportunity for growth, but more importantly, I think it's the ability to recruit particular talent very quickly. I think that is one of the things. Our hiring protocols are sometimes labyrinthian, and our ability to be nimble and seize talent when it's available is something that I would focus on.
I'm going to hand the mic over here. He's going to ask his own question.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary. My name is Adam Eisgrow. I'm with the Office of Government Relations of the American Library Association, which in turn is part of a coalition of dozens and dozens of tech companies, civil liberties organizations, many think tanks in Washington, all of whom oppose the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act in its current form because we believe and have detailed on multiple occasions why it too severely compromises Americans' rights to privacy under the Fourth Amendment. No speeches. I'd just like you to comment on that. Chairman Rogers, I'll note parenthetically, acknowledged in an outside conversation after his presentation that it's that opposition that is contributing to stalling the bill in the Senate. So if we do need a bill that accomplishes the important cybersecurity objectives, and we certainly agree there are some, and that is the case and the bill is stuck, how do we resolve that?
So let me say a couple points, if I may, and I appreciate the question. First and foremost, the Department of Homeland Security is not alone, but relatively unique in having a privacy office and a dedicated privacy rights officer, not only committed to the cyber arena and the very critical privacy issues that are implicated, but quite frankly, the privacy issues that are implicated in the breadth of the work that we perform. And so we very well understand the privacy sensitivities with respect to the bill and on a more macro basis. We operate right now on a voluntary system of the provision of information, okay? And we benefit greatly from the volunteering of information in the following ways. Number one, we are able to assist the provider of information in addressing the vulnerability or the exploitation that the volunteer has suffered. And so we can assist in actually remediating and preventing in the future further exploitations or vulnerabilities. Number two, the more volunteers that we have, the greater a perspective we have on the security landscape writ large, and the greater ability we have to make systemic recommendations and proposals to the private sector with which we interact. And so we encourage cooperation with us, but it is a cooperative environment within which we work and not an environment of compulsion.
More questions?
Yeah, can I ask one more? There's another one that came in from email. They're asking if DHS is contemplating publishing a roadmap for cyber and technology so that academia, national labs, and the private sector will know where you're headed and what's needed in the future.
So we are actually right now working on a plan. I don't know if I would call it a roadmap as much as a strategic plan and a vision for the future. So we are, in fact, working on that. And that is a shared plan, a plan of collaboration.
Mr. Secretary, I know that you're searching desperately to hire skilled people.
Yes.
And you've talked some about that. But we're also told that U.S. Cyber Command is competing with you. They want to add 6,000 people. And I just wonder, it seems to a lot of people that our offensive cyber programs are racing ahead. And we've heard today that on the defensive side, there's a lot of worry about inadequacy. We're not ready. What do you think about that perception that offense is outstripping defense?
I would respectfully disagree with that contention. I think both are moving forward. We specialize in the Department of Homeland Security on the defensive, not on the offense. Our ability to recruit talent is, I think, best exhibited by the fact that we brought on board Dr. Phyllis Schneck, an outstanding leader in the cybersecurity realm from the private sector, and we intend to draw additional talent just like her. This is a priority of the Secretary. Secretary Johnson visited Georgia Tech with Dr. Schneck to recruit the best and the brightest in cyber talent. I have seen firsthand the capabilities on the defensive side with our U.S. CERT team, which is a rapid response team that has been enlisted to assist in the defense posture, in the protection of the .gov space, in Heartbleed and others, the USIS situation that was reported on. I've also seen it deployed in the financial services sector and other sectors within the private industry most capably. And so I don't think that the defensive capabilities of the United States government to assist the private sector and to protect itself should be underestimated or understated.
Well, just to follow up to that, in this defensive capability you described, have you had any national level cyber exercises, and can you tell us what happened?
So we have had within the department tabletop exercises, and those are important to make sure that, quite frankly, all our response protocols and measures are best practice, and we identify room for improvement, and our tabletop exercise was no different. Come
on, you can be more specific than that. Tell me what happened.
I don't know that I should be, but with respect to a broader tabletop exercise, I actually don't know the answer to that question, quite frankly.
You know, General Hayden, the former director of the NSA, said the other day, it's impossible for the United States government to have an adult conversation with the American people about cybersecurity because there's too much secrecy about it. I think a lot of people feel we need to have that conversation. People need to know before there's an attack on the grid what our vulnerabilities are. What do you think about what General Hayden said? Do we need more openness about this?
It's interesting. From my vantage point, I see the conversations that we are having all across the country. So whether my answers satisfy those of you who are quite probative, I'm going to leave it for you to judge. But we have conversations all over the country with respect to cybersecurity. We meet with industry, we meet with citizen groups, we meet with privacy advocates, And so the dialogue is an ongoing one. So I don't know really to what Mr. Hayden was referring when he speaks to a lack of openness and too much secrecy.
Well, I think there is a feeling that sometimes the threats that we face haven't been fully revealed. People don't understand what could actually happen in a cyber attack. They're shocked at some of the things that they read about in the headlines now. How is it possible that 56 million credit cards at Home Depot, where everybody goes on every Saturday to buy things, how is it possible that if you're on alert and protecting the country, that people abroad could steal 56 million credit cards?
Oh, so that's a distinct point. That's a point that's a little bit discrete from the lack of a dialogue. The success of an attack is not the measure of whether we are communicating openly and effectively, nor is it, quite frankly, the measure necessarily of whether we are being vigilant. And this goes, I think, David, to your first point, the point of doom and gloom. And I don't mean to embrace it, but I want to address it very directly. Our sophistication is extraordinary, and that sophistication is evolving, is improving every day, as is the sophistication of those who wish to do us harm, whether it's through commercial advantage or otherwise. And the fact that an attack is successful does not necessarily speak to a deficiency, but rather it speaks to a need to be ever vigilant and to raise the bar of cyber hygiene across the board. I will share with you that in working with the private sector, we have, for example, observed varying levels of cyber hygiene amongst very significant corporate entities. Some are much more advanced in their cyber hygiene than are others. And what is incumbent upon us in the federal government is to proselytize, and to proselytize with our partners and our counterparts in the private sector about the need to elevate cyber hygiene. Where I think it's going to be, I personally, as a former practicing lawyer, where I think it's going to be interesting to watch the marketplace is on the development of a standard of care. When a consumer, a consumer of goods that has interacted with a company is harmed by reason of a breach of that company's cybersecurity, what is the responsibility, the liability of that company for the breach? What is the standard of care to which it should have adhered? What is the reasonable standard of care? Did it comply with that standard of care? Did it not? I think those types of questions, I think, comprise at least one aspect of the future landscape in the cybersecurity realm.
Just one quick follow-up, though. You seem to be saying that we shouldn't take what we've heard today, the worst, most serious breaches in our history, the idea that part of the private sector is unprepared, paralysis in Congress. We shouldn't take that as some sign of worry about performance?
Well, I didn't mean to. You asked me what keeps me up at night. So it presupposes that I am up at night and unable to sleep because of something in the cyber realm, which is true. So I don't mean to diminish the fact that there is cause for worry. What I mean to say is there's cause for action, and that is what I suggest we take away rather than a wringing of the hands. It's, I am a member of this company. When is the last time this company scrubbed its cybersecurity system? When is the last time it engaged in a tabletop exercise analog to determine whether the security safeguards are adequate to address the most basic threat, a more sophisticated threat, and a really elegant exploitation.
On that note, I think we're out of time.
Thank you very, very much. I think there is an appetite for dialogue, and I appreciate you coming. And thank you, David Hoffman. I want to say that all of our conversations, excerpts, both video and the written excerpts, will be online soon at WashingtonPostLive.com. And October 8th, next week, in the paper, there'll be a whole 6-page section devoted to cybersecurity, including much of the conversation we had today. And coming up, we have many things for Washington Post Live in the fall, including the day before Veterans Day, November 10th. We're going to have a conversation about veterans, the 2.6 million returning vets from Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of them are doing very interesting things in the community. And we have the CEO of Starbucks, Howard Schultz, who's written a book with one of the Washington Post reporters, Rajiv Chandrasekaran, called Love of Country. And they will be here on stage talking about veterans. Thank you. And we'll see you the next time.